At the dinner table, my father looked me in the eye and said, "Your sister is pregnant, so she gets your entire college fund." My brother-in-law laughed and told me to get a night shift job to build character. I just smiled, said okay, and hugged my mother. Then I walked upstairs. My phone lit up with a secure bank alert. 10 minutes later, a blood-curdling scream echoed from the dining room. Someone downstairs had just checked their balance. My name is Cornell. I am 68 years old, and what I am about to tell you is the story of how my family tried to bury my future to fund their greed. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. 6 years ago, I was 62 and standing on the absolute edge of a lifelong dream. After 40 years of breaking my back as a heavy machinery mechanic, wiping thick black grease from my hands, and inhaling harsh exhaust fumes in a cramped garage, I was finally retiring. I had a clear, unshakable plan. I was going to law school. It was an ambition I had deferred for decades to ensure my family stayed afloat through countless financial storms. To celebrate my retirement and my upcoming enrollment, my parents, Wendell and Shirley, hosted a formal family dinner at their house in Atlanta. I arrived with a bottle of sparkling cider, expecting a joyous toast to my new chapter. Instead, I walked directly into a calculated ambush. We sat around the heavy oak dining table. The roasted dinner sat untouched in the center, growing cold. My sister Tanya sat across from me, her hand resting protectively over her slightly swollen stomach. Beside her sat Bradley, her white, insufferably arrogant husband. Bradley tapped his silver fork against his crystal water glass. The sharp, clinking sound abruptly silenced the room. He wore a victorious smirk, the exact kind of smile a man gives when he knows he has won a rigged game. My father cleared his throat. He did not have the courage to look me in the eye. Wendell stared intently at his porcelain plate and announced that the $100,000 in the family education fund was being repurposed immediately. He stated that Tanya was pregnant with her third child and desperately needed a bigger house in the affluent suburbs. The money was going to her. My law school fund was completely wiped out with a single unapologetic sentence. I sat perfectly still. Bradley leaned back in his leather chair, swirling his water with profound satisfaction. He looked at me with pure, unfiltered condescension. He smugly suggested I take a night guard shift at a local warehouse to pay for my community college classes. He claimed working night shifts builds character and keeps old men out of trouble. Tanya giggled, a sharp, cruel sound that bounced off the dining room walls. Shirley, my mother, simply looked away. They sat in suffocating silence, waiting for me to explode. They fully expected me to yell, to flip the heavy table, to demand what was rightfully mine. They desperately wanted an aggressive reaction to justify their cruelty and paint me as the unstable villain. I did not give them a single shred of satisfaction. I knew the absolute truth about that money. It did not belong to Wendell, Shirley, or Tanya. 30 years prior, when I was in my early 30s, my parents lost their jobs during a brutal recession. The bank initiated immediate foreclosure on the very house we were sitting in right now. I stepped up. I worked grueling double shifts at the auto shop for 5 relentless years. I ruined my knees, damaged my back, and breathed in toxic chemicals just to save their home from the auction block. I paid off their massive debt in full and proudly handed them the deed. Afterward, I kept depositing my overtime earnings into a joint family account out of pure blind trust. I wanted a solid education fund ready for the day I finally put down my heavy wrench and picked up my law books. That exact $100,000 was my sweat, my physical pain, and my stolen youth neatly packaged in a bank account bearing my parents' names alongside mine. Bradley watched me closely, eager for a pathetic fight. I looked at his smug, privileged face. I looked at Tanya's greedy, expectant eyes. I looked at my parents who had spinelessly allowed my ultimate sacrifice to be handed over to an arrogant fool. I took a slow, deep breath. I placed my cloth napkin neatly beside my plate. I stood up, pushed my chair in, and looked directly at my father. I simply said, "Okay." The word hung in the air, heavy and absolute. I walked over to my mother. I leaned down, wrapped my arms around her frail shoulders, and gave her a long, warm hug. I told her the dinner smelled wonderful. Then, without another word to Bradley or Tanya, I turned my back on them and walked up the carpeted stairs to my old childhood bedroom. I stepped inside the dimly lit room and locked the heavy wooden door behind me. The loud click of the deadbolt felt like a final permanent seal on my past. I did not shed a single tear. Any lingering affection had instantly crystallized into cold, calculated action. I pulled my smartphone from my jacket pocket. I opened my secure banking application. The joint account balance sat proudly at exactly $100,000. My family had made a fatal, arrogant miscalculation. My parents were listed as account holders to facilitate future transfers, but I was the primary administrative signee. I had never relinquished ultimate digital control over the funds. I tapped the glowing screen. I navigated to my hidden private offshore account. It was a secure financial fortress neither Tanya Bradley nor my parents knew existed. I typed in the exact transfer amount down to the final cent. I pressed the bold button labeled Transfer All. The loading wheel spun on the screen for 3 agonizing seconds. A bright green checkmark appeared. The transaction was completely finalized. The joint family account instantly dropped to a permanent 0. I walked over to the window, watching the streetlights flicker on in the darkening Atlanta dusk. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, feeling an overwhelming sense of absolute liberation. Downstairs, the muffled sounds of conversation continued. I heard the clanking of silverware against porcelain plates. I heard Bradley laughing loudly at some terrible joke, celebrating a victory he had not earned. Then I heard the distinctive, high-pitched chime of a banking notification. Tanya had previously set up automated text alerts on her phone to aggressively monitor the account she thought she had just stolen from me. The laughter downstairs abruptly died. A suffocating, heavy silence stretched through the house for exactly 10 seconds. Then a primal, blood-curdling scream ripped through the floorboards. Tanya shrieked my name with a wild ferocity that literally shook the drywall. The illusion of their triumph shattered into a million jagged pieces. The money was gone, and the real war had just begun. The echo of my sister's scream was immediately replaced by the violent thud of heavy footsteps charging up the wooden staircase. The locked door of my childhood bedroom did not hold. Bradley kicked it open with a deafening crack that splintered the wooden doorframe into pieces. He stormed into the room like a rabid animal. His usually pale face was flushed a deep, ugly crimson, and the thick veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. Tanya trailed close behind him, her face completely drained of color, clutching her mobile phone as if it were a live grenade. Bradley did not bother to ask questions or demand an explanation. He lunged across the small room and grabbed the front of my shirt with both of his trembling hands. He yanked me forward, his hot breath reeking of expensive wine hitting my face. He demanded to know exactly where the money went. He screamed that they needed that exact $100,000 tomorrow morning to secure the down payment on a sprawling luxury villa in the northern suburbs. He yelled that I had maliciously stolen his future, completely ignoring the absolute fact that the money had entirely come from my own calloused hands. Tanya stood in the doorway, weeping, shouting that her unborn child would be homeless because of my unrelenting selfishness. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or attempt to match Bradley's pathetic aggression. I looked down at his perfectly manicured hands gripping my faded cotton shirt. These were hands that had never held a heavy wrench, never scrubbed engine grease from their fingernails, never worked a grueling double shift to save a family from financial ruin. With absolute practiced calm, I reached up and firmly gripped his wrists. I squeezed just hard enough to remind him that an old mechanic's hands possess a raw strength he could never comprehend. I smoothly brushed his hands away from my collar, stepping back to smooth out the fabric of my shirt. I looked him dead in the eye, letting the heavy silence stretch out across the room. He desperately expected a physical brawl to validate his explosive rage. I offered him nothing but a cold, impenetrable stare. The sudden lack of resistance unsettled him deeply. He took a hesitant step back, his arrogance faltering as he realized physical violence would not extract the funds he so desperately needed to maintain his extravagant illusion of wealth. I reached into my pocket and slowly pulled out my smartphone. I had anticipated their immediate panic and prepared a specific digital countermeasure for this exact confrontation. I opened a banking screenshot I had quickly edited months ago for a completely different security test on my devices. It looked entirely authentic down to the official bank logo and timestamp. I shoved the glowing screen directly into Bradley's face. The bold red text on the application warned that the joint account had been temporarily frozen. A severe security lock had been triggered by multiple suspicious login attempts originating from an untraceable foreign IP address. I calmly explained that the bank's fraud department had locked down all assets pending a full federal investigation. I told him that any attempt to move the funds, whether by me or anyone else, was now completely impossible until the authorities cleared the massive security breach. Tanya gasped loudly, her hands flying to her mouth in sheer horror. She frantically asked how long a federal banking investigation would take, panicking wildly about her pending real estate deadline the next morning. I simply shrugged my shoulders. I told them these high-level inquiries could take weeks or even months to resolve, especially when large sums of untraceable cash were involved. Bradley's face contorted with sheer panic and unbridled fury. He aggressively accused me of lying. He insisted I had orchestrated the freeze to punish them for the dinner table announcement. I tossed my phone casually onto the neatly made bed. I pointed toward the device and offered him a very simple, logical solution. I challenged him to pick it up and dial the local police precinct right then and there. I told him we could file a joint fraud report, bring financial detectives into the house, and have the authorities comprehensively audit the entire transaction history of the account to expedite the release of the funds. I kept my voice perfectly level, completely stripping away any trace of hostility or defensiveness. I willingly invited the law into the room. I laid the trap wide open, knowing exactly what his reaction would be. The mere mention of a police audit struck Bradley like a physical blow to the stomach. The aggressive fire in his eyes was instantly extinguished, replaced by a cold, unmistakable dread. He stared at the phone lying on the bed as if it were coated in lethal poison. He did not reach for it. I knew exactly why he froze in his tracks. Bradley loved to vigorously project the image of a highly successful venture capitalist, but his wealth was a fragile, illegal house of cards. I knew from passing conversations with my father that Bradley was currently dodging a massive IRS audit. He had been quietly funneling undeclared income through various shady shell companies to systematically evade federal taxes. Involving the police and federal banking investigators to trace a frozen account would inevitably shine a glaring spotlight on his own precarious financial records. A deep dive into his assets by authorities would destroy him entirely and likely send him to federal prison. He could not risk official scrutiny under any circumstances, and he knew I held the winning hand. Bradley let out a vicious curse, kicking the wooden doorframe in pure frustration. He grabbed Tanya by the arm, completely ignoring her confused pleas, and aggressively dragged her out of the room. He muttered darkly that they would find the money somewhere else, dragging her down the stairs and out the front door into the night. The house finally fell completely silent. My parents never came upstairs. They remained hidden in the dining room, too cowardly to face the wreckage they had enabled. I did not sleep. I sat in the dark, watching the hours tick by with profound clarity. At the first light of dawn, I pulled a small, battered suitcase from the closet. I packed only my essential clothing, my heavy legal textbooks, and the few personal documents I needed. I walked out of my childhood home without leaving a single note of goodbye. I drove my old truck 3 towns over. I pulled over by a rusted storm drain, removed my phone's SIM card, and dropped it through the metal grate. I watched it disappear into the dark water below. I vanished from their lives entirely, leaving Bradley and Tanya to face their inevitable financial ruin alone. 6 long years would pass in total silence before my past finally managed to track me down. 6 years of unbroken silence solidified my peace. I am now 68 years old. My real estate legal consulting firm occupies the entire top floor of a sleek glass and steel high-rise in downtown Atlanta. I built this pristine empire entirely from scratch, leveraging my late-in-life law degree and decades of hardened blue-collar grit. The heavy frosted glass doors of my private office seal out the chaotic noise of the city, providing a sanctuary of absolute control and order. I sit behind a sprawling mahogany desk, meticulously reviewing a multi-million-dollar commercial zoning contract. The digital clock on my monitor reads exactly 2 in the afternoon. The quiet, methodical rhythm of my day shatters instantly. My heavy oak office doors swing open with a violent, resounding crash that startles my executive assistant in the hallway. Tanya stands perfectly framed in the doorway. I have not seen my younger sister since the exact night I walked out of our parents' house with a single piece of luggage. The woman standing before me bears absolutely no physical resemblance to the arrogant, pampered favorite child I left behind. The expensive designer dresses, the sparkling jewelry, and the perfectly manicured nails are entirely gone. She wears a faded, ill-fitting gray sweater over a stained cotton shirt. Her hair is unkempt, pulled back in a frantic, messy knot that highlights the deep, dark bags shadowing her eyes. Her posture tells a story of chronic exhaustion and mounting panic. She breathes heavily, clutching a worn, faux leather purse against her chest like a physical shield against the world. The 6 years of bitter silence between us evaporate in a single desperate breath. She bypasses my assistant, who immediately picks up the phone to call building security. I raise my right hand, signaling my assistant to stand down and close the door. I lean back in my leather executive chair, keeping my hands resting flat on the polished mahogany surface. I do not offer a warm greeting. I do not ask how she has been. I simply watch the inevitable catastrophic consequences of her past arrogance walk right into my present reality. Tanya stumbles forward and collapses heavily into the leather guest chair positioned directly across from my desk. She does not bother with a polite introduction or a hollow apology for her 6-year absence. She immediately breaks down into violent, uncontrollable weeping. Between heavy, dramatic sobs, she blurts out the absolute ruins of her life. Bradley's supposedly brilliant venture capital firm is completely bankrupt. His arrogant financial maneuvering and reckless spending resulted in total insolvency, leaving them drowning in an ocean of insurmountable debt. She wipes her face with the back of her trembling hand, desperately trying to elicit my sympathy. She quickly shifts her tactic, weaponizing our parents' well-being to force my hand. She claims Wendell and Shirley are completely destitute, their retirement savings entirely drained by Bradley's failed investments. She states they are mere weeks away from being physically thrown out of their care facility and onto the unforgiving streets with absolutely nowhere to go. She leans across my desk, tears streaming down her face, demanding I fulfill my fundamental duty as the older, successful brother. She insists I owe it to our shared flesh and blood to write a massive check to save the family from absolute ruin. Her tears flow freely, a highly calculated performance designed to exploit a familial bond she gleefully helped sever 6 years ago. She conveniently omits any mention of the stolen education fund. She completely ignores the night she laughed right in my face at the prospect of me working a dangerous night guard shift to fund my dreams. She demands immediate financial salvation without offering a single shred of accountability for her past actions. I listen to her frantic, desperate pleas with total emotional detachment. My face remains a completely unreadable mask. I do not reach for my checkbook to ease her suffering. I do not offer empty words of comfort or false reassurance. I simply let her exhaust her rehearsed emotional manipulation. The silence in my office stretches out cold, clinical, and unyielding, forcing her to slowly confront the absolute failure of her theatrical performance. I remain perfectly silent, letting the heavy quiet suffocate her desperate, echoing sobs. Before I can offer a single word of response, a sharp metallic chime cuts through the thick tension in the room. A high-priority email notification from my lead attorney, Alyssa, flashes brightly across my desktop monitor. The bold red subject line demands immediate attention. I slide my mouse and open the secure document, ignoring Tanya's continued weeping. My eyes scan the dense legal text, processing the information with swift clinical precision. A newly acquired $500,000 commercial loan has just entered severe default status. The primary collateral securing this massive high-interest debt is a prime commercial property legally registered entirely in my name. The attached document clearly details a predatory lending agreement signed by an entity fraudulently claiming my identity. I look up from the glowing screen and lock eyes with my sister. Her tears instantly dry up under my piercing analytical stare. The true reality of her sudden appearance clicks into place with lethal clarity. Tanya did not barge into my office to beg for a brotherly handout to save our elderly parents. She did not come seeking familial reconciliation or sound financial advice. She came because dangerous, unregulated loan sharks are rapidly closing in on her and her husband. They desperately need a massive influx of untraceable cash to pay off a violent underground syndicate. They successfully weaponized my identity to secure illegal funds, and the ultimate bill has just come due. The tragic, tear-filled story about our parents facing imminent eviction is nothing but a convenient, fabricated smokescreen designed to obscure a massive, catastrophic fraud. I slowly turn the monitor around so the glowing default notice faces her directly. I watch the remaining color completely drain from her face as she realizes her hidden dagger has been fully exposed in broad daylight. The illusion of her fragile victimhood shatters entirely, leaving nothing but cold, hard evidence. She is not a desperate daughter seeking a savior. She is a cornered criminal standing completely defenseless in the office of the man she just defrauded. I grasped the edge of my flat-screen monitor and rotated it smoothly to face my sister. The harsh white glare of the default notice illuminated Tanya's tear-stained face. The moment her eyes locked onto the towering $500,000 figure and the bold red foreclosure warnings, her theatrical weeping ceased instantly. The transformation was absolute and chilling. The trembling victim vanished, replaced by a cornered animal staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the mahogany desk, and waited for the truth to spill out. The silence stretched until the sheer weight of the digital evidence crushed her remaining defenses. Tanya swallowed hard and finally confessed the mechanics of the betrayal. Bradley had kept a copy of my old driver's license and social security card from a joint family tax filing over a decade ago. He used those discarded documents to forge my signature on a massive high-interest commercial loan. He pledged a highly profitable downtown retail space I owned free and clear as the primary collateral. He funneled the $500,000 directly into his failing shell companies to appease a violent syndicate of unregulated underground lenders. I watched her lips move, detailing the fraud, but my mind analyzed the sheer audacity of her husband. Bradley had built this entire predatory scheme on a foundation of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He looked at me and saw nothing but an old, tired African-American mechanic. He genuinely believed a man who spent 40 years pulling transmissions and changing oil filters lacked the basic legal literacy to monitor his own credit profile or understand complex real estate encumbrances. Bradley completely ignored the reality of my late-in-life law degree. He blinded himself to the fact that I now ran the most aggressive real estate legal consulting firm in Atlanta. His racial and classist assumptions dictated that I would only discover the massive theft when the bank officially seized my property far too late to mount a legal defense. He thought I was a pathetic easy mark. Tanya finished her confession, her voice dropping to a harsh, raspy whisper. She admitted the underground lenders had completely drained Bradley's remaining accounts. The syndicate had officially run out of patience. They demanded their money by the end of the week, and they did not care whose name was printed on the fraudulent deed. Tanya did not display a single ounce of genuine remorse for orchestrating my financial ruin. Instead, she swiftly pivoted to her final, most desperate emotional weapon. She leaned aggressively across my desk, planting her palms flat against the polished wood, her eyes wide with a frantic, feral intensity. She stated that the loan sharks had completely bypassed Bradley's fake business addresses. The cartel had acquired the exact residential location of Wendell and Shirley. Our parents, both approaching 90 years old, were currently residing in a low-budget assisted living facility on the decaying outskirts of the city. Tanya's voice turned hard, dripping with manipulative venom. She explicitly outlined the lethal threat hanging over our family. The syndicate had already sent armed men to photograph the facility. If I dared to contact the Atlanta Police Department or initiate a federal fraud investigation to clear my name, the cartel would consider it a direct act of war. They would not target me in my highly secure, heavily guarded downtown high-rise office. They would immediately target the frail, defenseless old couple sitting blindly in their wheelchairs. Tanya weaponized our parents' profound vulnerability with terrifying efficiency. She demanded I simply write a personal check to cover the defaulted loan. She insisted that $500,000 was a mere drop in the bucket for my flourishing firm, a small, insignificant price to pay to keep our parents breathing and safe. She framed the vicious extortion not as a severe felony, but as my fundamental moral duty as the eldest son. According to Tanya, I had to swallow the massive debt, legally cover up Bradley's blatant forgery, and save the family name from violent, bloody destruction. I stared at the woman I had once carried on my shoulders when we were children. She was fully prepared to sacrifice my hard-earned empire to shield her criminal husband from the lethal consequences of his own boundless greed. She actively used the very parents who had gleefully handed her my law school funds 6 years ago as expendable human shields. The absolute audacity of her demand hung in the sterile air of my office. She fully expected me to cave under the sheer terror of losing our parents. She waited for me to pull out my checkbook, completely convinced that my deeply ingrained sense of familial loyalty would instantly override my legal survival instincts. I stood up slowly, bringing my full height to bear over the heavy desk. I looked down at Tanya with absolute detachment. I stated in a perfectly level, icy tone that I would not give her or Bradley a single dime. I reached across the desk and pressed the intercom button. I firmly instructed my executive assistant to send the building's private security team to my office immediately. Tanya recoiled instantly as if I had struck her across the face. Her features twisted into a mask of pure vitriolic rage. She began to scream at the top of her lungs, calling me a heartless monster, a vindictive traitor to my own blood, and a selfish old man who cared more about his corporate bank accounts than his own mother and father. The heavy oak doors swung open. 2 large uniformed security guards stepped swiftly into the room. I pointed a steady finger directly at my sister. The guards flanked her without hesitation, grabbing her arms and physically lifting her from the leather guest chair. She kicked and thrashed wildly, hurling vile obscenities at me as they forcefully marched her out into the bright corporate hallway. The heavy doors clicked shut abruptly, cutting off her frantic, echoing shrieks. The absolute pristine silence of my sanctuary returned. I did not waste a single second on useless emotional reflection. I picked up my smartphone and immediately dialed my lead attorney, Alyssa. She answered on the very first ring. I outlined my immediate counteroffensive with cold, clinical precision. I instructed Alyssa to completely freeze the compromised commercial asset, initiate a hostile title defense, and prepare a forensic financial trap designed to hunt down every hidden penny Bradley had buried in his offshore accounts. I made it absolutely clear that I would not negotiate with or pay the criminal syndicate. I would systematically dismantle Bradley's remaining financial infrastructure and hand his digital corpse directly over to the federal authorities. Alyssa quickly confirmed the aggressive legal strategy, but she astutely raised the immediate tactical flaw. The physical threat to Wendell and Shirley was brutally real and entirely imminent. The cartel was actively watching the assisted living facility. Before I could launch a full-scale legal war against my brother-in-law, I had to completely neutralize his sole piece of leverage. I hung up the phone. I grabbed my car keys and my tailored suit jacket. To protect my parents from the rapidly approaching violence, I had to personally infiltrate the nursing home and secure their physical extraction before Bradley or his violent creditors reached them first. I steer my car away from the glittering downtown skyline, driving purposefully toward the decaying industrial outskirts of Atlanta. The facility Tanya chose for our parents is a grim cinder-block structure sitting behind a cracked, weed-infested asphalt parking lot. It resembles a forgotten warehouse far more than a legitimate place of medical care. I push through the heavy smudged glass front doors. The oppressive, suffocating stench of industrial bleach entirely fails to mask the underlying odor of stale urine and profound neglect. Fluorescent lights buzz erratically overhead, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the scuffed linoleum floors. I bypass the indifferent receptionist, relying entirely on the room number my investigators managed to extract from county public health records earlier that hour. I walk down a long, narrow corridor echoing with the hollow sounds of blaring daytime television and isolated chronic coughing. I reach room 114. The door is propped open by a chipped rubber wedge. I step inside. The room is no larger than a standard walk-in closet, completely devoid of personal touches, warm colors, or family photographs. 2 narrow institutional beds occupy the cramped space. Wendell and Shirley sit slumped in mismatched rusted wheelchairs facing a blank beige wall. They look devastatingly frail. The vibrant, stubborn parents I remember from 6 years ago have been entirely erased by time and betrayal. Their skin hangs loosely on their bones, and their shoulders are permanently bowed under the weight of utter defeat. I close the door quietly behind me. The soft metallic click draws my father's attention. Wendell slowly turns his head. His clouded eyes widen in sheer disbelief. He weakly taps my mother's arm. Shirley looks up. The moment she recognizes my face, a dam breaks. She lets out a ragged, breathless sob, burying her face in her trembling, paper-thin hands. Wendell begins to weep openly, his heavy tears catching in the deep wrinkles lining his cheeks. I walk forward and kneel on the cold, hard floor between their wheelchairs. I do not offer empty words of false comfort. I simply take their cold, fragile hands in mine, anchoring them to reality. The 6 years of bitter silence dissolve instantly into the harsh, undeniable truth of their suffering. My father grips my hands with a desperate, lingering strength. He forces himself to look me directly in the eyes, stripping away the absolute last remnants of his patriarchal pride. His voice is a brittle, raspy whisper as he confesses the ultimate fatal mistake. 2 years ago, as his health rapidly declined and my mother required specialized care, Bradley arrived at their house carrying a briefcase full of legal documents. Bradley painted a masterpiece of deception. He promised them immediate access to the finest private medical facilities in the entire state. He swore he would personally manage their retirement funds to generate enough sustainable wealth to cover premium round-the-clock nursing care. Blinded by fear and completely seduced by his arrogant confidence, Wendell and Shirley signed over absolute, irrevocable power of attorney. They surrendered total legal control of their medical directives and their financial assets. The moment the ink dried on those notarized pages, the glorious illusion vanished. Bradley immediately executed his authority with ruthless predatory efficiency. He did not move them into a luxury care home. He dumped them into this miserable state-funded facility, isolating them entirely from their community and their friends. Wendell's voice breaks completely as he reveals the final, most devastating layer of the betrayal. Bradley aggressively liquidated their entire life savings within a matter of days, channeling the untraceable funds directly into his failing shell companies to appease his aggressive creditors, to cover his massive fraudulent tracks and generate even more immediate capital. Bradley placed their beloved family home on the open market. The very house I sacrificed my youth and broke my physical body to save from foreclosure 30 years ago is currently listed for a rapid below-market cash sale. My mother sobs quietly, apologizing repeatedly for their blind foolishness. They traded the son who gave them his sweat and blood for a son-in-law who offered them nothing but polished, lethal lies. I squeeze my father's hands firmly, completely absorbing the magnitude of the theft. Bradley has meticulously stripped them of their wealth, their home, and their basic human dignity. The situation is far more desperate than my initial forensic audit indicated. Before I can formulate a strategic plan to physically extract them from the premises, the door to the small room flies open. A stern, heavy-set facility director marches in, clutching a rigid plastic clipboard. He is closely flanked by two broad-shouldered security guards wearing tight, dark blue uniforms. The director glares at me with outright hostility. He demands my immediate identification and asks what business I have in a restricted patient area. I stand up slowly, releasing my parents' hands, and calmly state my name. The director flips through the papers on his clipboard with agitated, aggressive movements. He stops at a specific page stamped with a glaring red legal seal. He informs me with icy bureaucratic authority that I am legally barred from the entire facility. He shoves the clipboard forward, displaying the official court-recognized directive. Bradley had weaponized the absolute power of attorney to place my name on a strict, non-negotiable no-entry list. Bradley legally categorized me as a hostile threat to their well-being, explicitly ordering the medical staff to deny me any physical or communicative access whatsoever. My parents cry out in immediate protest, begging the director to let me stay. The director completely ignores their pleas, treating them like invisible pieces of broken furniture. He signals the two security guards. He states that if I do not vacate the premises immediately, he will call the local police and have me formally arrested for criminal trespassing. I do not raise my voice or attempt to argue with a man blindly following fraudulent paperwork. I look down at my parents, offering a single firm nod to assure them this is not the end of the fight. I turn toward the door. The guards do not allow me to walk out with my dignity intact. They step forward aggressively, grabbing my arms with unnecessary bruising force. They physically drag me down the long, fluorescent-lit corridor, completely ignoring my calm compliance. The public humiliation is absolute and highly calculated. They haul me through the crowded main lobby in full view of the indifferent staff and shove me violently through the heavy glass doors. I stumble forward, catching my balance on the cracked concrete of the cold, desolate parking lot. The heavy doors lock shut behind me with a definitive thud. I stand alone in the freezing afternoon air, methodically brushing the dirt from my tailored suit jacket. The physical ejection leaves me isolated on the empty asphalt, perfectly setting the stage for the violent ambush rapidly approaching my position. The cold air hit my face as the heavy glass doors locked shut behind me. I stood on the cracked asphalt of the facility parking lot, straightening my tailored suit jacket. A gleaming midnight black luxury SUV sat parked illegally across two handicapped spaces near the entrance. Bradley leaned casually against the pristine hood. He wore a sharply tailored navy suit that likely cost more than my parents' monthly care facility bill. He was twirling a heavy set of keys around his index finger with absolute sickening arrogance. He had been waiting for me. He pushed off the hood and sauntered toward me, a vile smirk plastered across his pale face. He gestured expansively toward the massive vehicle, proudly declaring that my stellar credit score had easily financed his new ride. He did not bother to hide his criminality. He flaunted it like a badge of honor. He stepped into my personal space, invading it with the smell of stale cigars and expensive cologne. He looked me up and down, his eyes dripping with undisguised racial and generational contempt. He mockingly commended me for going to law school at my advanced age, but he assured me it was a colossal waste of time. He leaned in close, lowering his voice to a harsh, venomous whisper. He told me that the American legal system was fundamentally built by and for men exactly like him. He bragged that courts and judges would always inherently trust a wealthy, well-connected white venture capitalist over an old, disgruntled African-American mechanic claiming identity theft. He laughed, a harsh grating sound that echoed across the empty concrete. He promised me that any lawsuit I filed would be buried under mountains of expensive litigation until I died of old age or went entirely bankrupt. He was utterly convinced of his own invincibility. He believed his privilege offered him an impenetrable shield against any consequence. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly rigid, my face an unreadable mask of absolute calm. I let him talk. I let him dig his own grave with every arrogant syllable that spilled from his mouth. His desperate need to assert dominance was his ultimate weakness. I did not offer a single word of rebuttal to his racist, entitled monologue. My complete and utter silence infuriated him more than any insult ever could. Bradley's triumphant smirk slowly dissolved into a scowl of genuine frustration. He desperately craved a reaction. He wanted me to scream, to cry, to throw a wild, undisciplined punch that he could easily dodge and use to justify his own violence. My stoic, unyielding silence completely short-circuited his fragile ego. He began to pace back and forth, hurling insults at me, demanding that I speak. He called me a coward. He insulted my parents, mocking their frailty and their foolishness for trusting him. Still, I offered him absolutely nothing. I merely stared right through him, treating him as if he were nothing more than a minor annoyance standing in my path. The sheer lack of validation pushed his boiling rage past the breaking point. His face flushed a dark, violent crimson. He abruptly stopped pacing and planted his expensive leather shoes firmly on the asphalt. He drew his right arm back with a sudden, vicious speed. He drove his clenched fist directly into my jaw. The sheer force of the unprovoked blow snapped my head to the side. A sharp, blinding pain exploded across my face. My feet slipped on the loose gravel and I fell backward, hitting the hard concrete with a heavy thud. The metallic, unmistakable taste of fresh blood flooded my mouth. The rough asphalt scraped the palms of my hands, but I forced my muscles to remain entirely limp. Every ingrained survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to rise, to clench my fist, to completely dismantle this arrogant fool right here in the parking lot. I had spent 40 years doing grueling physical labor. I could have easily shattered his jaw and broken his ribs. I absolutely refused to give him that satisfaction. I remained flat on my back on the cold ground. I slowly turned my head upward. I did not look at Bradley, who was now standing over me, breathing heavily with a mix of shock and brutal adrenaline. I stared directly past his shoulder. Mounted securely above the facility's sliding glass doors was a high-definition security camera. Its small circular red light glowed brightly in the fading afternoon sun, blinking with a steady, reassuring rhythm. I wiped a thin stream of blood from the corner of my mouth. I had positioned myself exactly within the camera's clear line of sight. The trap was perfectly set. The sharp, piercing wail of police sirens suddenly shattered the quiet suburban air. The sound rapidly amplified, echoing off the concrete walls of the nursing home. Bradley froze his eyes, darting frantically toward the main road. The aggressive predator vanished in an instant, entirely replaced by a terrified, calculating coward. Realizing the authorities were mere seconds away, he immediately resorted to a desperate, pathetic performance. He threw himself onto his knees right beside me. He violently clawed at his own face, deliberately scratching his cheek to draw blood. He began to wail loudly, clutching his chest and rocking back and forth, perfectly staging the scene to make it appear as though I had viciously attacked him. 3 marked police cruisers careened into the parking lot, their red and blue lights washing over the cracked asphalt. Heavy doors slammed open as uniformed officers rushed the scene with their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Bradley immediately pointed a trembling finger down at me. He frantically yelled that an aggressive, deranged old man had ambushed him in the parking lot and tried to steal his vehicle. The officers ordered us both not to move. Before anyone could take another step, a sleek black sedan pulled smoothly into the lot, parking directly behind the squad cars. Alyssa, my lead attorney, stepped out. Her posture radiated absolute professional authority. She did not look at Bradley. She walked straight to the commanding officer, holding up a sleek digital tablet. The screen displayed a crystal-clear, high-definition live feed downloaded directly from the facility's security server. I had instructed Alyssa to subpoena emergency access to the camera network the exact moment I arrived. The video played the entire encounter in brutal detail. It showed my absolute stillness. It showed Bradley's aggressive posturing, his frantic pacing, and his violent, entirely unprovoked punch to my face. The commanding officer watched the brief footage twice. He turned away from the screen and locked his eyes on Bradley. The false tears on Bradley's face instantly dried up. Two officers stepped forward simultaneously. They grabbed Bradley by his expensive suit jacket, hauling him roughly to his feet. They spun him around and slammed him face first onto the pristine hood of his stolen luxury SUV. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting securely around his wrists echoed across the parking lot. The sterile fluorescent lights of the downtown police precinct cast a harsh, unforgiving glare across the scuffed linoleum floor. I sat on a hard wooden bench in the main waiting area, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting calmly on the leather handle of my briefcase. The heavy glass doors of the precinct burst open with a violent crash that echoed sharply against the concrete walls. Tanya stumbled through the entrance, her chest heaving as she desperately scanned the crowded room. She spotted me and sprinted across the lobby. The meticulously crafted image of a wealthy suburban socialite was entirely obliterated. Dark streaks of expensive mascara ran in jagged lines down her pale, blotchy cheeks. Her designer clothes were wrinkled and hastily thrown on. She threw herself onto the wooden bench beside me, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She did not offer a genuine apology for the horrific events at the nursing home. She launched immediately into a frantic, high-pitched barrage of demands. She begged me to march over to the duty desk and completely drop the aggravated assault charges against her husband. She weaponized her third pregnancy with ruthless precision, aggressively pushing her swollen stomach forward as a physical guilt trip. She began to weep loudly, an ugly theatrical sound deliberately designed to draw the sympathetic attention of the passing uniformed officers. She shrieked that her innocent children could not bear the psychological trauma of seeing their father locked behind cold iron bars. She insisted that an assault conviction would completely destroy Bradley's remaining business prospects and render them permanently homeless. She claimed family loyalty required me to overlook a minor physical altercation for the greater good of my unborn nephew. I stared straight ahead at the bulletin board on the opposite wall. I did not offer her a tissue. I did not attempt to soothe her manufactured hysteria. I let her exhaust every single emotional manipulation tactic she possessed. Her desperation was a raw, palpable energy vibrating in the sterile room. She grabbed my tailored sleeve, her fingernails digging sharply into the dark fabric. She demanded I fix the situation instantly. She had spent the last 6 years comfortably ignoring my existence, yet she fully expected me to act as her absolute savior the very second her fraudulent world began to collapse. I slowly turned my head and looked directly into her tear-filled eyes. I was entirely immune to her performance. I calmly reached down and snapped open the brass clasps of my pristine leather briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks completely silenced Tanya's frantic sobbing. I withdrew a single impeccably typed sheet of legal paper and placed it flat on the empty space of the wooden bench between us. I produced an engraved silver fountain pen from my inner jacket pocket and laid it precisely parallel to the document. Tanya stared at the paper, her eyes darting back and forth in utter confusion. I leaned forward and outlined the absolute terms of her salvation with cold, uncompromising clarity. The document was a total, irrevocable relinquishment of the power of attorney she and Bradley held over Wendell and Shirley. It was drafted by my lead attorney, Alyssa, with ironclad precision. The contract mandated the immediate and permanent transfer of absolute medical, legal, and financial control of our parents directly to me. I explained that the instant she signed her name on the dotted line, Bradley would completely lose all legal authority to make any decisions regarding their care, their housing, or their remaining assets. I offered her a brutal direct trade. Her signature on that specific piece of paper would guarantee her husband's immediate freedom. I promised to walk directly up to the precinct duty desk, inform the arresting officers that the parking lot altercation was a simple familial misunderstanding, and formally drop every single assault charge on the record. I made it absolutely clear that this was not a negotiation. There would be no counteroffers, no delays, and no discussions with her currently incarcerated husband. She had exactly 1 minute to make a choice. She could either sign away her fraudulent control over our parents, or she could watch Bradley get processed, fingerprinted, and transferred to the county jail to await a lengthy criminal trial. Tanya stared at me with pure, unadulterated venom. She realized her emotional manipulation was completely useless against a man who only operated in facts and contracts. The illusion of her control was totally shattered. She looked down at the silver pen. She was a woman cornered by her own husband's explosive arrogance. She desperately needed Bradley out of that holding cell to deal with the violent loan sharks actively hunting them down across the city. She could not afford the luxury of pride or the delay of a lengthy legal battle over our parents. She reached for the pen with a violently shaking hand. Tanya snatched the heavy silver pen from the wooden bench. She did not bother to read a single paragraph of the dense legal text. Her sheer desperation and profound arrogance blinded her entirely to the fundamental rules of contract law. She hastily scribbled her signature across the bottom line, the dark ink smearing slightly under her trembling hand. She shoved the paper back toward me, her face twisting into a mask of triumphant spite. She genuinely believed she had won the exchange. She thought she was trading a worthless legal document for her husband's absolute freedom, completely convinced she could easily manipulate our parents into signing a new power of attorney the very next day. She threw the pen onto the floor and sprinted down the hallway toward the holding cells, desperate to deliver the good news to Bradley. I carefully picked up the silver pen and tucked the signed document securely into my breast pocket. Alyssa stepped out from an adjacent interview room, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum. I handed the folded paper directly to her. I instructed her to file it with the county clerk the exact moment the courthouse doors opened in the morning. Tanya had completely failed to comprehend the true weight of her signature. The document she had just blindly authorized contained a deeply embedded, highly specific legal clause. The contract did not simply transfer medical and financial authority. It explicitly and retroactively voided any pending real estate transactions initiated under Bradley's previous power of attorney. The immediate legal consequence was absolute and devastating. The active real estate listing for Wendell and Shirley's family home was instantly and permanently pulled from the commercial market. The pending cash sale Bradley desperately relied upon to appease the violent loan sharks was entirely legally blocked. I walked up to the duty desk and fulfilled my end of the bargain, formally requesting the assault charges be dropped entirely. I walked out of the precinct into the cool night air, leaving Bradley to taste the bitter ash of his hollow freedom. He would walk out of that holding cell believing he had successfully dodged a massive bullet. He would check his phone moments later and discover that the lucrative house sale was completely dead. His final desperate lifeline to pay the cartel had just been completely severed by his own wife's hurried hand. The silent adjustment was tightening its inescapable grip. The heavy steel doors of the county detention center slammed shut with a resounding metallic finality. Bradley stood on the cracked concrete sidewalk, shivering in the crisp morning air. His expensive navy suit was horribly wrinkled, smelling of cheap institutional disinfectant and stale sweat. Tanya's frantic signature had successfully secured his immediate release, officially dropping the aggravated assault charges before the dawn arraignment. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket with trembling fingers. He fully expected to see a confirmation email from his escrow agent regarding the expedited cash sale of Wendell and Shirley's family home. Instead, his screen displayed a severe automated legal notification from the county clerk's office. The property listing had been completely and permanently voided. The underlying power of attorney had been entirely revoked and legally transferred to Cornell. Bradley stared at the harsh black text, his arrogant facade crumbling into absolute unadulterated panic. His wife had blindly signed away the only tangible asset that could possibly appease the violent syndicate hunting them down. The IRS was methodically closing in on his fraudulent shell companies, but the underground cartel demanded their $500,000 by the end of the week. Stripped of his leverage and facing imminent physical destruction, Bradley's corporate composure completely evaporated. He reverted to the frantic, reckless instincts of a cornered animal. He accessed his final hidden offshore emergency fund, completely draining the account to secure untraceable cash. He purchased a prepaid burner phone from a corner bodega and arranged a meeting in a desolate, abandoned industrial park. He handed thick-bound stacks of $100 bills to two hardened local enforcers. He explicitly ordered them to completely gut Cornell's pristine downtown legal consulting firm under the cover of darkness. Bradley wanted the old mechanic terrified, broken, and financially paralyzed. He desperately believed a display of brute street violence would force me into submission and compel me to surrender the deed to the family home. The morning sun cast a harsh, glaring light across the top floor of my downtown high-rise. I stepped out of the private elevator. The pristine silence of my corporate sanctuary had been entirely obliterated. Shards of shattered tempered glass blanketed the plush charcoal carpet like a layer of jagged winter ice. The heavy frosted doors leading to my executive suite hung completely unhinged, their steel frames violently bent out of shape. My receptionist's desk was overturned, the expensive computer monitors smashed into unrecognizable tangles of wire and cracked plastic. Filing cabinets had been aggressively pried open, their contents dumped and trampled across the floor. I walked slowly through the total devastation, the thick soles of my leather shoes grinding the broken glass into the carpet. I did not pull out my phone to dial emergency services. I did not feel a single ounce of fear, violation, or surprise. Growing up in the unforgiving, rough neighborhoods of South Atlanta had provided me with a profound practical education in street-level violence. I knew intimately how hired muscle operated. Men who break into buildings under the cover of darkness for quick cash possess absolutely no loyalty to the coward who hired them. They are simple, predictable creatures driven entirely by raw greed and immediate leverage. Calling the police to document the property damage would only invite useless bureaucratic delays and disrupt the precision of my counteroffensive. I stepped over a smashed chair and walked directly into my private office. I surveyed the damage with cold analytical detachment. The intruders had systematically ransacked every single corner of the room, violently tearing apart the leather seating and destroying the artwork. They were aggressively hunting for a hidden wall-safe emergency cash reserves or easily pawned valuables. I looked down at the center of my scarred mahogany desk. The violent intruders had taken the bait perfectly. Before leaving to extract my parents from the nursing home the previous afternoon, I had anticipated Bradley's desperate, thuggish retaliation. I had deliberately placed a thick, crimson-bound financial ledger directly in the center of the immaculate wooden surface. The bright red cover was highly visible, designed to instantly attract the attention of men tearing a room apart for hidden assets. The ledger did not contain client information or corporate banking details. It contained a meticulously assembled forensic accounting dossier compiled by Alyssa and my top investigators. The heavy pages documented the exact irrefutable trajectory of the $500,000 predatory loan Bradley had fraudulently secured using my identity. More importantly, it contained absolute, undeniable proof of Bradley's sheer suicidal arrogance. He had not given the entire sum to his creditors. He had actively skimmed off the top of the cartel's principal advance. The ledger tracked $50,000 of the syndicate's own money flowing directly into a private jewelry boutique to purchase a high-clarity diamond necklace for a local mistress. Bradley had stolen from the very monsters he owed. The thugs he hired to destroy my office belonged to the exact same underground syndicate that held his massive debt. I knew they would seize the bright red ledger, hoping to leverage my corporate financial secrets for a secondary payday. Instead, they unknowingly walked out with a detailed map of Bradley's ultimate betrayal. I stood amidst the ruined glass and steel of my empire, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored suit. The physical destruction of my office was a completely irrelevant operational expense. The trap had sprung flawlessly. The violent threat hanging over my elderly parents and my own life had been instantly and permanently redirected. The cartel no longer cared about a voided house sale or a forged signature. They now possessed absolute proof that Bradley had used their illegal funds to finance his marital infidelities. Bradley had paid his own executioners to break into my office and retrieve the exact weapon that would guarantee his complete destruction. The silent adjustment was accelerating toward a brutal, inevitable conclusion. The heavy steel service door clicked shut behind me, sealing off the wreckage of my firm. The narrow alleyway was bathed in the flickering, sickly orange glow of a dying sodium street lamp. The air smelled of damp cardboard and motor oil. I took exactly 3 steps toward my parked car before the shadows detached themselves from the brick walls. 3 men materialized, blocking the only exit. They wore dark, unassuming clothes, their postures radiating the practiced, loose-limbed stillness of professional enforcers. A massive black sedan idled silently at the mouth of the alley, its headlights cut completely blocking the street view. The lead enforcer stepped forward. He was a mountain of a man with a scarred jawline and dead reptilian eyes. He did not waste time with intimidation tactics or theatrical threats. He stated flatly that my brother-in-law owed their employers $500,000. He acknowledged the red ledger they had acquired from my office earlier that morning, confirming Bradley had indeed skimmed their funds to finance his mistress. However, the syndicate still required their principal loan repaid in full immediately. Bradley had successfully convinced them that as a high-powered corporate attorney, I was the true architect of the family finances. He had fed them a desperate lie, claiming I held the massive liquidated profits from my parents' estate in a heavily guarded trust. The enforcer reached inside his leather jacket, resting his hand deliberately on the heavy metallic bulge at his hip. He demanded the $500,000 by midnight, or my life would cover the deficit. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands in surrender or attempt to negotiate a payment plan. I simply stared at the enforcer with absolute chilling detachment. The fear they expected to see was completely absent. Growing up in the unforgiving neighborhoods of South Atlanta, I had learned a fundamental truth about men who execute violence for a living. They are ruthless businessmen. They do not care about family drama, and they absolutely loathe being manipulated by desperate debtors. I smoothly reached into my tailored suit jacket. The three men instantly tensed, preparing to draw their weapons. I raised my empty left hand in a slow, calming gesture. With my right hand, I pulled out my slim, matte black laptop. I informed the enforcer that Bradley was entirely broke, but I knew exactly where their stolen money was hiding. I walked deliberately past the two flanking thugs, ignoring their aggressive posturing, and placed my laptop flat against the cold, polished hood of their black sedan. I flipped the screen open. The bluish light illuminated the grim faces of the enforcers crowding around me. I bypassed the security protocols and opened the encrypted forensic file my legal team had finalized less than an hour ago. I did not offer vague accusations. I presented them with a mathematically perfect execution of truth. The screen displayed a complex web of wire transfers completely bypassing Bradley's failing domestic shell companies. I pointed to the glowing green numbers tracing the exact route of their missing $500,000. Bradley had not lost their money in bad investments, nor had he given a single dime to me. He had systematically laundered the entire sum through a series of untraceable microtransactions, funneling the capital directly into a private, heavily encrypted offshore account in the Cayman Islands. He was actively hoarding their wealth while sending them to extort his innocent family members. The lead enforcer leaned closer to the screen, his jaw clenching as the sheer magnitude of Bradley's disrespect fully registered. I did not let him process the financial betrayal before delivering the final fatal blow. I tapped the keyboard, pulling up a highly restricted flight manifest I had legally subpoenaed using my firm's federal fraud clearance. The document displayed a confirmed first-class one-way ticket to Paris, France. The passenger name was clearly printed as Bradley Dawson. The flight was scheduled to depart from Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport in exactly 3 hours. I looked directly into the lead enforcer's cold eyes. I stated clearly that Bradley had used them to destroy my office as a cheap diversion. He orchestrated the break-in and directed them to this alleyway specifically to buy himself enough time to board that flight and vanish across the Atlantic with their money. The absolute silence in the alley was deafening. The thugs realized they had been played for absolute fools by a desperate, arrogant coward. The enforcer did not say a single word to me. He slammed the laptop shut, shoving it hard into my chest. He spun around and barked a single sharp command to his men. The three men piled into the black sedan with violent efficiency. The engine roared to life and the heavy tires screeched violently against the asphalt, leaving a thick cloud of burning rubber as they sped out of the alleyway, rocketing toward the international airport. I stood alone in the dark, the crisp night air cooling the sweat on the back of my neck. The trap had closed with absolute lethal perfection. The syndicate was no longer my problem. I drove back to my secure downtown condominium, poured myself a single glass of bourbon, and waited for the inevitable fallout. The digital clock on my bedside table flashed 2 in the morning when the silence was finally shattered. My encrypted mobile phone began to vibrate violently against the glass nightstand. The caller identification displayed Tanya's name. I let it ring 3 times before swiping the screen to accept the call. I did not say hello. I simply listened to the chaotic, breathless sounds echoing through the speaker. Tanya was screaming hysterically, her voice completely ravaged by pure, unadulterated terror. She could barely form coherent sentences between her violent, ragged sobs. She screamed that Bradley was gone. He had never returned from his supposed late-night business meeting. She had woken up to a freezing empty house and a devastatingly clear reality. Driven by a sudden sickening intuition, she had rushed to his private home office and forced open the heavy steel wall safe hidden behind his bookshelf. It was entirely gutted. Every single stack of emergency cash, all the emergency bearer bonds, and the thick folders of foreign currency were completely missing. Her voice cracked into a high-piercing wail as she revealed the ultimate depth of his betrayal. He had not just taken the money. He had taken her grandmother's heirloom wedding ring directly from her jewelry box. He had meticulously removed the children's passports from the fireproof lockbox. He had systematically stripped her of every single financial resource and viable exit strategy, abandoning his pregnant wife to face the violent wrath of the underground syndicate entirely alone. The line went dead. She was left utterly destitute, completely homeless, and totally defenseless. The absolute desperation of her reality left her with only one agonizing option. She was now forcefully compelled to physically confront the very brother she had so gleefully betrayed. A torrential downpour hammered the gleaming glass facade of my downtown high-rise building. Massive peals of thunder rattled the floor-to-ceiling windows, vibrating through the quiet, heavily guarded security of my lobby. The digital intercom on the wall buzzed with a sharp, insistent tone. The night concierge's voice crackled through the speaker, maintaining a strained professional courtesy to mask his obvious alarm. He informed me that a severely distressed woman claiming to be my sister was currently causing a massive scene at the main entrance. She was aggressively demanding immediate access to my private residence and refusing to leave the premises despite the escalating storm. I instructed the concierge to let her pass the outer security gate, but to hold her outside under the covered portico. I grabbed a heavy umbrella and took the private elevator down to the ground floor. The heavy glass doors slid open to reveal Tanya standing on the wet marble steps. She was completely soaked to the bone. The freezing, relentless rain plastered her ruined designer clothes against her shivering frame, clearly highlighting the tight swell of her pregnant belly. She had driven straight from her gutted suburban mansion, fleeing the terrifying shadows of the cartel enforcers her husband had provoked. The moment she saw me step into the light, her shivering intensified into a theatrical, desperate display. She lunged forward, stopping just short of my personal space, her hands raised in a frantic, trembling plea. She did not offer a single word of apology for weaponizing our elderly parents. She expressed zero remorse for her active complicity in Bradley's massive financial fraud. Instead, she immediately drew her favorite, most manipulative emotional weapon. She aggressively leveraged family loyalty, weeping loudly that her unborn child was currently at risk of freezing on the violent city streets. She demanded I open my doors, insisting that blood dictated I provide her with immediate shelter, a warm bed, and full financial protection from the catastrophic mess Bradley had left behind. She fully expected me to instantly fold under the heavy visual weight of her pregnancy and usher her blindly into my secure, wealthy life. I stood perfectly still under the bright security lights of the portico. I did not step aside to welcome her into the warm, dry lobby. I did not signal the anxious concierge to fetch a heated towel, nor did I offer to purchase her a hot cup of coffee to ward off the chill. I simply looked at the shivering, broken woman standing in the raging storm. Her frantic, entitled demands for familial duty triggered a very specific, deeply buried memory. 6 years ago, we sat together around our parents' cramped dining room table. I was wearing a heavy, grease-stained mechanic's shirt, my joints aching with absolute exhaustion from pulling a brutal 12-hour shift at the auto garage. My parents had just cheerfully announced they were entirely draining the very savings account I had spent decades helping them build. They proudly handed the entire sum directly to Tanya to finance a lavish down payment on her brand-new marital home with Bradley. I had explicitly earmarked a significant portion of that money to finally pay for my late-in-life law school tuition. When I quietly raised a respectful objection about my shattered educational timeline, Tanya did not offer a single ounce of sympathy. She sat comfortably across the table, delicately slicing into a piece of roasted chicken, her pristine manicure glittering under the warm dining room light. She looked at me with total unbothered condescension. She told me I was a grown man who had no business relying on our parents' generosity. She casually suggested I simply stop complaining and pick up an overnight shift at the garage to fund my own legal ambitions. She had happily hoarded the family wealth while carelessly condemning me to break my physical back in the dark. That absolute lack of empathy had forged my current legal empire. Looking at her now trembling violently in the cold wind, I felt absolutely no obligation to cushion her steep fall. The sister I knew had died at that dining room table 6 years ago. The woman standing before me was merely a stranger demanding the exact charity she had once gleefully denied me. I slowly reached into the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. Tanya's wet, mascara-stained eyes widened with sudden greedy anticipation. She fully expected me to pull out a platinum corporate credit card, or the heavy electronic keycard to a spare luxury penthouse suite. Instead, I withdrew a dull, scratched brass key attached to a cheap, faded plastic numbered tag. I dropped it directly into her open, waiting palm. Next, I pulled a tight, plastic-wrapped bundle from under my arm and pressed it firmly against her chest. The transparent packaging clearly displayed the rough, coarse fabric of a standard industrial janitor's uniform. Her triumphant expression collapsed instantly into profound, horrifying confusion. She stared down at the cheap items, her mind completely failing to process the reality of the transaction. I explained in a perfectly level, icy tone that the brass key belonged to a low-budget weekly motel located on the decaying industrial east side of the city. The rent was paid in cash for exactly 7 days. I informed her that the stiff uniform belonged to an entry-level sanitation crew operating in a nearby commercial warehouse. I had called in a minor favor with a former corporate client to secure her an immediate placement on the grueling night crew. I looked her dead in the eye, my voice cutting cleanly through the roaring thunder echoing off the concrete. I repeated the exact words she had weaponized against me 6 years ago. I told her she could work and that it builds character. Tanya recoiled violently as if the plastic bundle had physically burned her wet skin. Her sheer desperation instantly mutated into pure, insulted, vitriolic pride. She let out a piercing shriek of absolute rage. She violently hurled the wrapped uniform onto the wet marble steps and kicked the brass motel key straight into a muddy, rain-filled pothole in the street. She screamed that she was a respectable woman who would never scrub warehouse floors like a common peasant. She spun on her heel and stormed off into the torrential downpour, marching fiercely toward her parked car. Her absolute refusal to accept a humiliating reality left her entirely destitute, effectively sealing her fate to starve alone in a freezing vehicle, setting the stage for the total impending destruction of her final shreds of pride. 3 brutal days systematically dismantled Tanya's entire manufactured reality. The relentless freezing rain finally stops, leaving behind a biting autumn chill that turns the interior of her stalled luxury sedan into an icebox. She wakes up on the 4th morning violently shivering her designer coat, offering absolutely no protection against the creeping cold. The leather seats she once flaunted as a status symbol now feel like a rigid, freezing prison. Her severe hunger transitions from a dull ache into a sharp, blinding cramp that radiates through her pregnant belly. She drives her remaining gasoline down to a local high-end grocery store, desperate for a simple meal. The cashier swipes her sleek platinum credit card. The machine immediately flashes a hard red decline notification. She tries a second card, then a third. Every single financial lifeline is completely severed, the accounts frozen or entirely drained by Bradley's frantic exit. The cashier stares at her with polite impatience, forcing Tanya to abandon the meager groceries and walk out empty-handed. She retreats to her car and frantically dials her extensive network of country club friends and wealthy socialite acquaintances. She begs for a temporary loan, a warm couch, or even a hot meal. The responses are uniformly devastating. The women who gladly drank her expensive champagne just weeks ago suddenly invent convenient excuses, cite their husband's strict financial rules, or simply send her calls directly to voicemail. Tanya realizes with crushing clarity that her entire social circle was built exclusively on the foundation of Bradley's stolen money. Stripped of her wealth, she is instantly exiled from their pristine world. The brutal, undeniable weight of starvation entirely crushes her remaining arrogance. She drives back to the luxury apartment building where she had demanded my charity just 72 hours prior. She parks down the street, keeping her vehicle hidden from the concierge's view. She walks slowly toward the marble steps, her body aching with absolute exhaustion. The muddy pothole in the street has dried into a cracked, filthy depression. Tanya drops to her knees on the rough asphalt. She reaches into the dirt and retrieves the plastic-wrapped industrial janitor's uniform. The clear plastic is smeared with thick brown mud. She clutches the uniform tightly against her chest, a silent, agonizing surrender to the exact reality she had mocked. She has no other choice but to accept the grueling labor to survive. Tanya reports to the grim industrial address printed on the uniform's packaging just before midnight. The commercial cleaning company operates out of a stark, windowless warehouse filled with the overpowering stench of industrial ammonia and cheap floor wax. She stands in line with exhausted, hard-working men and women who do not care about her smeared makeup or her previous zip code. A gruff night supervisor hands her a heavy yellow plastic bucket, a pair of thick rubber gloves, and a laminated identification badge. Tanya looks down at the badge and feels the last fragment of her pride completely shatter. The parent corporation clearly listed on the bottom of the identification card is my own real estate holding company. I own the very sanitation firm she is now legally bound to. The supervisor assigns her to the heavy labor division and points her toward a battered transport van. She spends the next 4 hours hauling a massive, rusted utility cart across endless stretches of commercial linoleum. The harsh industrial chemicals bleed right through the cheap rubber gloves, burning her delicate skin and raising raw, stinging blisters across her palms. Her lower back screams in absolute agony as she repeatedly bends over to scrub black scuff marks and empty, overflowing trash receptacles. The physical toll of the labor is brutal, relentless, and entirely unforgiving. Every muscle in her body aches with a profound exhaustion she has never experienced in her entire privileged life. At 4 a.m, the supervisor orders her crew to board the van for their final premium assignment. Tanya stares out the dirty window as the van pulls up to a towering, familiar structure of glass and steel. It is my downtown executive tower. She is marched through the underground service entrance and directed to the top floors. She pushes her heavy cart down the pristine carpeted hallways, surrounded by the towering mahogany doors and abstract art she once considered her natural birthright. She is now explicitly forbidden from speaking to the building's occupants or using the main passenger elevators. She is strictly confined to the shadows, a completely invisible entity expected to erase the dirt left behind by the wealthy and the powerful. She grips her mop handle tightly, the crushing reality of her new existence bearing down heavily on her tired shoulders. The supervisor orders Tanya into the executive washroom on the top floor. The space is a cavernous expanse of imported Italian marble-polished brass fixtures and panoramic glass windows overlooking the glittering city skyline. Tanya drops to her knees on the cold stone. She plunges a stiff, bristled brush into her bucket of soapy, chemical-laced water and begins to fiercely scrub the grout lines. The heavy wooden door suddenly swings open. Tanya freezes her blistered hands, clutching the wet, dirty toilet brush. I walk into the restroom alongside 3 of the most prominent real estate developers in Atlanta. The men are wearing immaculate, bespoke suits, deeply engaged in a high-stakes conversation regarding a massive downtown zoning acquisition. They step around Tanya without breaking their stride or pausing their discussion. To them, she is simply a piece of the building's infrastructure, an entirely unseen laborer meant to be stepped over and ignored. I stand at the marble sink, turning on the brass faucet to wash my hands. I look into the expansive mirror spanning the wall. Tanya stares at my reflection from her position on the wet floor. Her eyes are wide, filled with a desperate, silent plea for recognition. She waits for me to acknowledge her, to show a flicker of pity, or even to offer a cruel remark. I dry my hands on a crisp linen towel. I adjust my silk tie. I look at her reflection with absolute, chilling indifference. I do not see my sister. I do not see a pregnant woman. I treat her exactly as she treated me 6 years ago when I begged for a fraction of mercy regarding my own future. I treat her as completely invisible. I turn and walk out of the washroom, picking up the conversation with the developers without missing a single beat. The heavy door clicks shut, sealing Tanya alone in the cold, cavernous room. The absolute humiliation tears a ragged sob from her throat. She drops the brush into the dirty water, her spirit entirely broken. But her despair is abruptly interrupted. Her cheap, prepaid phone vibrates loudly in her pocket. The caller identification displays an unknown international number. Bradley has somehow bypassed the cartel's net and secretly returned to the city, setting up a desperate collision course that will drag her directly into the center of a lethal crossfire. Bradley never made it onto the first-class flight to Paris. The syndicate enforcers intercepted him just steps from the international security checkpoint at Hartsfield-Jackson. They did not cause a public scene in the crowded terminal. They simply flanked him, pressed the cold steel barrel of a suppressed weapon against his ribs, and marched him firmly into an isolated airport maintenance stairwell. In that echoing concrete space, they systematically delivered a brutal physical lesson. They forced him to unlock his digital wallet using biometric facial recognition, while blood poured from his shattered nose. Within 3 agonizing minutes, the cartel entirely drained his hidden Cayman Island accounts, reclaiming their stolen $500,000, along with every single penny Bradley had hoarded for his escape. They left him bleeding on the cold stairs, explicitly warning him that the immense crippling interest on his fraudulent loan was still due by midnight. Stripped of his wealth, his stolen passport, and his arrogant facade, Bradley was transformed instantly into a hunted, desperate animal. He stumbled out of the airport and crawled back into the city shadows. Paranoia completely consumed him. Every passing car looked like a cartel hit squad. Every dark corner held an executioner. Driven by sheer blinding panic, he targeted his absolute last remaining lifeline. He bypassed the heavy security presence at the front lobby of my downtown executive tower by slipping through an unsecured loading dock door he remembered from a previous corporate visit. He crept into the cavernous, dimly lit freight elevator, his breathing ragged and shallow. His designer navy suit was torn and stained with dried blood. His meticulously styled hair was matted with sweat and dirt. He rode the industrial elevator up to the top floors, his mind frantically assembling a suicidal plan. He firmly believed that if he could physically force me to sign over the deed to Wendell and Shirley's home, he could offer the cartel a tangible real estate asset to buy back his life. He stepped out onto the executive floor, gripping a heavy, serrated hunting knife he had shoplifted from a sporting goods store along the highway. He moved silently down the carpeted hallway, a broken fugitive seeking violently extracted salvation. The heavy mahogany desk in my private office was buried under a mountain of complex zoning contracts. I sat in the high-backed leather chair analyzing a specific liability clause under the focused beam of a brass reading lamp. The rest of the expansive office was wrapped in deep shadows. The sudden violent slam of the heavy frosted glass door shattering against the doorframe broke the absolute silence. Bradley kicked the door shut behind him and threw the deadbolt with a frantic, trembling hand. I did not jump. I simply closed the file folder and looked up at the ruined man standing in my office. His face was a bruised, swollen mask of pure desperation. He lunged across the expansive room before I could reach for the security panic button mounted beneath my desk. He vaulted over the leather guest chairs and crashed into my desk, scattering vital documents across the floor. He lunged forward and grabbed a fistful of my tailored shirt, violently jerking me upward. The cold, jagged steel of the serrated hunting knife pressed sharply against my throat. The blade bit into my skin, drawing a thin line of warm blood. Bradley was shaking uncontrollably, his sour metallic breath washing over my face. He screamed at me to open my safe and produce the deed to the family home. He wept openly, his voice cracking as he described the cartel enforcers waiting for him in the dark. He demanded I transfer absolute financial ownership of my parents' estate to his name immediately. He pressed the blade harder against my vocal cords, swearing he would cut my throat and take the documents over my dead body. He was no longer a calculating corporate fraudster. He was a cornered rat willing to commit capital murder to secure another 24 hours of life. I stared directly into his bloodshot eyes. I made absolutely no sudden movements. I calmly informed him that his signature was completely legally worthless, and killing me would only guarantee his swift execution by lethal injection. My cold, undeniable logic only fueled his manic, terrified rage. He raised the heavy knife, preparing to strike a fatal blow. The rhythmic squeak of an industrial cleaning cart echoed softly down the deserted executive hallway. Tanya leaned heavily against the plastic handle, pushing the massive utility bin over the plush carpet. Her muscles screamed in agony. Her hands burned with raw intensity from hours of exposure to harsh alkaline chemicals. She stopped the cart near the entrance to my private suite, preparing to empty the wastebaskets. She noticed the frosted glass door was aggressively pulled shut, and the interior blinds were violently knocked askew. She crept forward, her rubber-soled shoes completely silent against the floor. She pressed her face close to a narrow gap between the glass and the wooden frame. The dim glow of the brass reading lamp illuminated a scene of absolute horror. She saw Bradley. She saw the man who had completely drained her bank account, stolen her grandmother's wedding ring, and abandoned her to face the cartel's wrath entirely alone. She watched as her husband violently pressed a serrated hunting knife directly against her brother's throat. Tanya froze, her breath catching sharply in her lungs. The heavy plastic toilet brush slipped from her blistered fingers, landing soundlessly on a soft cleaning rag. The ultimate defining choice of her entire life materialized in that dark hallway. She could turn around, push her cart quietly to the service elevator, and walk away. She could let the two men destroy each other, effectively wiping her slate clean. But as she watched Bradley scream manic threats at the man who had provided her with a brutal but honest lifeline, the lingering remnants of her entitled arrogance completely evaporated. She looked down at the heavy, solid steel wrench resting in her utility cart, a tool used for unbolting industrial plumbing fixtures. She remembered the 6 years of my unacknowledged sacrifice. She remembered the freezing rain outside the luxury apartment building. Tanya reached down and wrapped her blistered hands tightly around the cold steel handle of the heavy wrench. The overpowering stench of ammonia suddenly felt like a clarifying agent. She stepped away from the cart and raised her foot, fully preparing to kick the locked door off its hinges to save the brother she had once gleefully betrayed. The heavy oak door splintered inward with a deafening crash as Tanya kicked it off its brass hinges. The sudden violent intrusion shattered the tense standoff in my private office. Bradley instinctively flinched, his bloodshot eyes darting toward the noise. In that crucial fraction of a second, the serrated edge of his hunting knife wavered just enough for me to lean back completely out of lethal range. Tanya did not hesitate or wait for him to recover his footing. She charged across the expanse of the executive suite, her industrial rubber boots squeaking against the polished mahogany floor. She had abandoned the steel plumbing wrench in her cart, opting instead for the brutal extended reach of her commercial mop. She gripped the thick, solid ashwood handle with both blistered hands, raising it high above her head like an executioner's axe. Bradley turned his bruised face toward her, his expression twisting from manic desperation to sheer unadulterated shock. He opened his mouth to shout a command, fully expecting the subservient wife he had so casually discarded to cower before his weapon. He was entirely wrong. Tanya swung the heavy wooden pole with every ounce of raw, accumulated rage she possessed. The thick wood sliced through the air with a sharp whistle and cracked violently across the back of Bradley's skull. The sickening sound of splintering wood and fracturing bone echoed loudly through the room. Bradley's eyes rolled back instantly. His knees buckled under his own weight, folding like a poorly constructed house of cards. The serrated hunting knife slipped from his numb fingers and clattered harmlessly across the hardwood floor, sliding to a stop against the base of my desk. He collapsed face first onto the expensive Persian rug, letting out a low, wet groan of absolute agony before slipping into unconsciousness. Tanya stood over his motionless body, her chest heaving violently. She dropped the shattered remains of the mop handle, her hands shaking from the massive adrenaline dump. She looked down at the man who had ruined her pristine life, her face an unreadable mask of exhaustion and vengeance. She had made her choice, explicitly severing her ties to the fugitive bleeding at her feet. I slowly stood up from my high-backed leather chair, smoothing the wrinkled fabric of my tailored shirt. I calmly reached up and adjusted my silk collar, feeling the thin, stinging line where Bradley's blade had scratched the surface of my skin. I did not rush to Tanya to offer comfort or express profound gratitude for her sudden violent intervention. I simply looked down at Bradley's motionless form with total clinical detachment. Tanya stared at me, expecting shock or relief to wash over my face. She demanded to know why I was not frantically calling the authorities to report the attempted homicide. I leaned forward and pressed my thumb against a concealed biometric scanner mounted discreetly beneath the lip of my desk. I informed her that dialing emergency services was entirely unnecessary. I explained that my corporate security protocols were far more advanced than Bradley's amateur infiltration tactics. Exactly 10 minutes prior, I had noticed a brief systematic glitch in the encrypted feed from the freight elevator cameras. I knew intimately that cartel enforcers did not use service entrances. They walked through the front door. A shadow sneaking through the loading dock could only be one specific, desperate coward. I had triggered the building's silent high-level distress signal the moment Bradley breached the top floor. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The heavy thud of tactical boots suddenly thundered through the outer stairwell. The shattered remains of my office door were kicked aside entirely as a heavily armed police tactical unit stormed into the room. 6 officers in full ballistic gear fanned out with military precision, their assault rifles raised and sweeping the corners of the suite. The lead detective barked sharp commands, instantly securing the perimeter and neutralizing the threat. They spotted Bradley unconscious on the rug and immediately pinned his arms behind his back, securing his wrist with heavy steel handcuffs. Tanya watched the tactical execution with wide, terrified eyes. She realized in that cold moment that my entire confrontation with Bradley had been a calculated stalling tactic. I had never been in true mortal danger. I was simply keeping him engaged and distracted until the authorities arrived to permanently remove the infection from my sanctuary. Two burly tactical officers grabbed Bradley by the shoulders and forcefully dragged him to his feet. Blood streamed freely down his face from the massive gash on his scalp, dripping steadily onto his ruined designer suit. The sudden violent motion jerked him back into a hazy, disoriented state of consciousness. He blinked rapidly, his bloodshot eyes adjusting to the harsh tactical flashlights cutting through the dim office lighting. He looked at the armed detectives, then at the shattered mop handle, and finally at his wife standing by the cleaning cart. The complete reality of his situation crashed down upon him with crushing finality. His offshore accounts were drained by the syndicate. His physical escape route was destroyed. He was caught red-handed attempting armed extortion and capital murder inside a high-security corporate tower. His life as a wealthy, untouchable fraudster was permanently over. Faced with decades inside a federal penitentiary, Bradley's self-preservation instincts mutated into pure, venomous spite. He refused to sink into the abyss alone. He locked his gaze on Tanya, his bruised face twisting into a hideous, feral sneer. He screamed loudly at the lead detective, his voice echoing violently off the mahogany walls. He officially and formally accused his wife of orchestrating the entire financial collapse. He frantically claimed that Tanya was the true undetected mastermind behind the fraudulent $500,000 cartel loan secured using my forged identity 6 years ago. He detailed exactly how she had manipulated the banking documents, diverted the illicit funds, and gleefully spent the cartel's money on luxury real estate and expensive jewelry, while using him as a convenient corporate shield. Tanya froze her mouth, dropping open in absolute paralyzing horror. The lead detective turned slowly, his hard eyes locking onto the trembling woman in the soiled janitor's uniform. He did not hesitate or ask for a detailed explanation. He signaled to a secondary officer. The officer marched forward, grabbed Tanya's blistered hands, and swiftly locked a pair of cold steel handcuffs securely around her wrists. He loudly recited her Miranda rights, his voice a steady rhythmic drone that signaled the complete end of her freedom. The officers forcefully marched both Bradley and Tanya out of the executive suite, throwing her directly into the back of a waiting squad car. The ultimate destruction of her pride was absolute, setting the stage for a brutal federal interrogation. The temperature inside the precinct interrogation room was deliberately maintained at a freezing, uncomfortable level. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pale illumination across the scarred metal table bolted to the center of the floor. Tanya sat rigidly in a heavy steel chair. She was still wearing the mud-stained, oversized janitor's uniform, her wet hair plastered against her pale, exhausted face. Her wrists were securely fastened to a heavy iron ring bolted to the table, the cold metal biting into her blistered skin. The heavy steel door groaned open, admitting two hardened federal detectives. They did not offer a cup of water or a blanket to ward off her violent shivering. They moved with absolute calculated efficiency, slapping a massive stack of thick manila folders directly onto the metal table. The lead detective opened the files, spreading a fan of banking documents, forged signatures, and offshore routing numbers in front of her face. He stated flatly that Bradley had formally and legally thrown her under the bus to save himself. Her husband had provided a sworn recorded statement explicitly naming Tanya as the absolute mastermind behind the $500,000 syndicated loan fraud committed 6 years ago. The detective traced a thick finger over a series of highly incriminating transfer logs explaining that the paper trail perfectly aligned with Bradley's vicious accusation. He looked at Tanya with eyes devoid of any pity and delivered the mathematical reality of her situation. The federal prosecutor was aggressively pursuing charges of wire fraud, grand conspiracy, and cartel-linked money laundering. The minimum mandatory sentence carrying those combined charges was exactly 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The sheer crushing gravity of the number physically buckled Tanya's spine. Her breath hitched and a guttural, ragged sob tore through her chest. The final remnants of her high society arrogance entirely evaporated under the terrifying threat of decades in a concrete cage. She wept openly, the tears carving clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. She begged the detectives to stop. She frantically demanded her phone call, screaming that her brother was a prominent, high-powered corporate attorney. She wielded my name as a desperate shield, pleading with them to bring me into the room, entirely convinced I would immediately deploy my legal empire to rescue her from the abyss. The heavy steel door clicked open a second time. I stepped into the freezing interrogation room. I was wearing an immaculate charcoal suit, my posture radiating the absolute unbothered calm of a man holding all the cards. Alyssa walked in closely behind me, her expression a mask of professional icy detachment clutching a sleek leather briefcase. Tanya lunged forward as far as the iron chain would allow, her tear-streaked face lighting up with a sudden, desperate surge of hope. She cried out my name, begging me to tell the detectives that Bradley was lying and to authorize my firm to represent her defense immediately. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I did not reach out to hold her trembling hand or assure her that the nightmare was over. I walked deliberately to the edge of the metal table and stood completely still. I reached into my jacket pocket, withdrew a small black digital voice recorder and placed it directly in the center of the table. I looked down at my shivering sister and pressed the play button. The tiny speaker crackled to life, filling the cold room with the unmistakable audio of a bustling family dinner. Tanya froze her breath, catching sharply as she recognized the ambient sounds of our parents' cramped dining room from exactly 6 years ago. Her own voice echoed clearly from the device, dripping with gleeful, condescending arrogance. The recording perfectly captured her explicit, willful acknowledgement that the massive sum of money our parents were handing over was originally earmarked for my law school tuition. The audio proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that she had actively conspired with Bradley to misappropriate those specific funds, mocking my future while eagerly calculating the down payment on her luxury estate. The recording captured her cruel laughter as she suggested I simply work another grueling night shift to cover the stolen cash. I reached down and stopped the recording. The silence in the interrogation room was suffocating. Tanya stared at the black device, her eyes wide with paralyzing horror. The absolute realization crashed down upon her. I had never forgotten that dinner. I had never simply moved on. I had held on to that digital confession for 6 long years, patiently waiting for the exact moment when the arrogant thieves would attempt to rewrite history. The tape completely obliterated her defense of innocent ignorance, proving she was a willing, malicious participant in the original financial betrayal. Alyssa stepped forward smoothly, taking control of the room. She opened her leather briefcase and extracted a stark, single-page legal document, placing it on the table directly next to the digital recorder. She looked at Tanya with chilling professional authority. She explained that the district attorney was offering exactly one incredibly narrow window of survival. The document was a binding, non-negotiable federal plea agreement. The terms were brutally simple. Tanya was required to take the witness stand in open court. She would become the prosecution's star witness against her husband. She was legally bound to detail every single layer of Bradley's financial crimes, explicitly exposing the offshore money laundering, the cartel extortion, and the original syndicate loan fraud. Alyssa stated clearly that Tanya would systematically destroy Bradley's defense and guarantee his absolute conviction. Tanya shook her head, tears streaming down her face, terrified of the violent retaliation Bradley or the syndicate might unleash. I leaned closer to the table, my voice dropping to a low, uncompromising pitch. I delivered the final ultimatum. I informed her that if she refused to sign the agreement and testify, I would personally hand the digital recording directly to the federal prosecutor. I promised her that the audio evidence would secure her a 20-year sentence alongside her husband. I told her that she would give birth in a federal prison hospital and spend the next 2 decades staring at a concrete wall. The choice was absolute. She could destroy the husband who had violently betrayed her, or she could sacrifice her entire life for a man who had left her to starve in the rain. Tanya looked at the recorder, then at the stark legal contract. Her hands trembled violently as Alyssa uncapped an expensive fountain pen and offered it to her. The absolute destruction of her pride was finalized in that freezing room. She reached out with shaking fingers, grasped the pen, and signed her name on the dotted line. The ink bled slightly onto the paper, sealing her forced cooperation. She had surrendered completely. The trap had closed with flawless, inescapable precision. By legally binding herself to the prosecution, Tanya guaranteed that Bradley's upcoming federal trial would be an absolute massacre entirely of his own making. The federal courthouse was a monument of polished oak and cold marble, a fitting arena for the complete dismantling of a man's life. Bradley sat at the defense table, his posture severely slumped. The bespoke Italian suits he once flaunted had been confiscated, replaced by a cheap, ill-fitting gray polyester suit provided by his heavily discounted legal counsel. His hair was thinning, devoid of its expensive styling product, leaving him looking hollow and pathetic. When the trial officially commenced, his defense attorney realized immediately that the financial evidence stacked against his client was insurmountable. Desperation bred a vile, highly transparent legal strategy. The attorney paced before the jury box, aggressively attempting to shift the narrative away from wire fraud and cartel extortion. He launched a deeply offensive, racially charged defense. He pointed a trembling finger directly at me, painting me as a vindictive, deeply angry black man harboring decades of unfounded jealousy. He spun a fabricated tale claiming I was actively trying to destroy a respectable, affluent white family out of pure spite. He suggested I had manipulated the financial records to frame Bradley because I could not accept my brother-in-law's inherent business superiority. He leaned heavily on dog whistles, attempting to exploit any latent bias within the jury. I sat perfectly still in the gallery. I did not clench my jaw or break my stoic composure. Reacting with visible anger would only validate his pathetic manufactured narrative. I simply observed his theatrical desperation with the clinical detachment of a predator watching its prey bleed out. The defense attorney's voice echoed through the high-ceilinged room, his face flushed with the exertion of maintaining such a colossal, desperate lie. He painted Bradley as a victim of my supposed legal tyranny, an innocent family man caught in the crosshairs of a ruthless corporate attack. The performance was entirely theatrical, utterly devoid of factual substance, and completely reliant on the fragile hope that prejudice would eclipse forensic evidence. The federal prosecutor called me to the witness stand on the second morning of the trial. I walked to the front of the courtroom with slow, measured steps, my tailored Navy suit radiating quiet authority. I swore the oath and took my seat. The defense attorney immediately attempted to rattle me during cross-examination, sneering and throwing aggressive, bad-faith questions designed to elicit an emotional outburst. I completely ignored his pathetic insults. I opened the thick, heavily indexed black binder resting on the wooden ledge in front of me. I did not raise my voice or engage in theatrical posturing. I simply read the numbers. I meticulously detailed every single fraudulent wire transfer, chronologically tracing the movement of the $500,000 syndicate loan. I presented the precise internet protocols used to route the stolen funds through dummy corporations. I produced the irrefutable forensic analysis of the forged power of attorney, highlighting the exact discrepancies in the digital signatures. I submitted the bank records proving Bradley had directly funneled $50,000 of cartel money to purchase a high-clarity diamond necklace for his local mistress. The cold, hard data flooded the courtroom, drowning out the defense attorney's racist rhetoric. I laid out the offshore account routing numbers in the Cayman Islands, explicitly connecting Bradley to the underground syndicate. Every time the defense attorney attempted to interrupt with a frivolous objection, the federal judge swiftly overruled him. The sheer, overwhelming volume of mathematically perfect evidence systematically dismantled the defense's entire fabricated narrative. I watched the color rapidly drain from the defense attorney's face as he realized his strategy had catastrophically failed. Bradley shrank lower into his wooden chair, staring at the floor as his financial crimes were broadcast to the federal jury in agonizing, undeniable detail. My testimony was a flawless clinical execution of facts, entirely stripping Bradley of his false victimhood and exposing him as a desperate, reckless fraudster. The final lethal blow was delivered not by the prosecution, but by the woman Bradley had systematically destroyed. Tanya was called to the stand on the third day of the proceedings. She walked to the witness box wearing standard drab civilian clothing, her previous high society glamour entirely eradicated. She did not look at her husband. Under oath, she corroborated every single document I had presented. She detailed the forged loan, explicitly exposing Bradley's deep, active ties to the violent underground cartel. She narrated his frantic attempt to extort me at knife point, laying bare his complete descent into criminal desperation. Her forced cooperation was absolute, tearing away the final shreds of Bradley's defense. The jury did not deliberate for long. They returned with a unanimous verdict of guilty on all counts, completely dismantling the defense attorney's vile, racially motivated narrative through the sheer weight of forensic accounting. The federal judge struck his heavy wooden gavel with absolute, resounding authority. He stared down at Bradley with total disgust and officially sentenced him to 15 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The heavy steel cuffs were locked around Bradley's wrists, and he was physically dragged out of the courtroom, his life effectively over. The legal war was definitively won. My corporate empire was secure, and the cartel threat was permanently neutralized by federal incarceration. However, the silent adjustment of my world was not yet fully complete. With Bradley imprisoned and Tanya utterly defeated, the fractured dynamics of my remaining family faced one final fatal adjustment. I left the federal courthouse and walked toward my waiting car, programming the navigation system for the city hospital where my elderly parents resided. The navigation system guided my heavy sedan through the rain-slicked city streets, ending at the sterile, sprawling complex of Atlanta General Hospital. I bypassed the main reception desk, flashing my legal credentials to bypass the security protocols and access the secure palliative care wing. The heavy stress of the past month, the violent cartel threats, the brutal revelation of Bradley's massive financial fraud, and the absolute destruction of Tanya's pristine facade had exacted a devastating physical toll on my elderly parents. Their rapid health decline was an agonizing, accelerated crash that left the doctors entirely helpless. I stepped into their dimly lit double-occupancy room. The air smelled of sharp antiseptic and fading life. The rhythmic, agonizingly slow beeping of the twin cardiac monitors set a grim tempo in the quiet space. Wendell and Shirley lay in adjacent hospital beds, their bodies frail and diminished beneath the thin white cotton sheets. I walked to the space between them, resting my hands lightly on the cold metal bed rails. My father turned his head slowly, his cloudy eyes filling with deep, unbridled sorrow. My mother reached out with a trembling, translucent hand, gripping my tailored sleeve with a desperate, fading strength. They wept openly, the tears catching in the deep creases of their weathered faces. They did not make excuses or attempt to justify the past 6 years. In the harsh, clinical light of the hospital room, they confronted their ultimate failure. My father's voice was a ragged, breathless rasp as he begged for my absolute forgiveness. He acknowledged the staggering depth of their blindness. They had willfully favored their daughter, eagerly financing her luxurious illusions, while entirely enabling Bradley's predatory abuse. They had happily drained their life savings to elevate Tanya, leaving me to build my legal empire from the absolute ground up through sheer punishing labor. They recognized the bitter irony that the son they had financially abandoned was the only one standing in the room, actively shielding them from total ruin. I looked down at the two fragile people who had brought me into the world. I did not offer hollow platitudes or dismiss their crushing guilt. I stood in silent, stoic acknowledgement of their profound remorse, letting the heavy truth settle permanently between us. My father shifted his gaze from my face toward the shadowed corner of the hospital room. I followed his line of sight. A severe, professionally dressed man holding a thick leather folio stepped forward into the sterile light. He was an independent, state-certified notary public, summoned by Wendell strictly outside of my firm's purview to ensure absolute legal objectivity. My father requested his reading glasses. He placed them carefully on his face, his trembling fingers struggling with the wire frames. He looked at me with a newfound rigid clarity. He stated that apologies and tears were ultimately worthless without definitive binding action to correct the scales. The notary opened the folio and placed a meticulously drafted legal document directly onto the rolling hospital tray. It was a comprehensive ironclad revision of their last will and testament. Wendell and Shirley had spent the previous 48 hours consulting with an independent estate lawyer to legally dismantle every previous provision. My father gripped a heavy black pen. He did not hesitate. He signed his name with a fierce, deliberate finality, followed immediately by my mother. The notary stamped the document, permanently sealing their final decree. Wendell looked up, his breathing shallow, but his intent absolutely clear. He explained the exact parameters of the new arrangement. The entirety of their remaining estate was immediately transferred. The deed to the family home, successfully recovered and legally scrubbed clean of Bradley's fraudulent liens, was now registered solely in my name. Every remaining liquidated asset, every pension payout, and every surviving investment portfolio was placed under my absolute unilateral control. They had systematically and completely stripped Tanya of her inheritance. The daughter who had demanded their wealth and discarded their dignity was legally excised from the family lineage. They left her nothing but the harsh, unforgiving reality of the streets she currently navigated. The notary packed his briefcase, nodded respectfully, and exited the room, leaving the newly executed power dynamic hanging heavily in the quiet air. The transfer of the family empire was complete, shifting the burden of legacy entirely onto my shoulders. I accepted the heavy manila envelope containing the finalized documents, feeling the absolute weight of their ultimate trust. I did not intend to hoard the family wealth or allow it to sit stagnant in a corporate vault. I turned toward the door as Alyssa stepped quietly into the hospital room. She had been waiting in the corridor armed with her digital tablet and an open, secure connection to my firm's senior financial architects. I immediately dictated the exact uncompromising terms of the estate's future right there in the sterile glow of the palliative care unit. I instructed Alyssa to channel the entirety of the liquidated assets into a heavily fortified, impenetrable educational trust. The beneficiary of this trust was not Tanya, but her unborn child. I established a series of brutal, mathematically perfect restrictions. The funds were legally locked, completely inaccessible for any form of daily living expenses, housing, or personal debt relief. The money could only be dispersed directly from the trust to an accredited university or educational institution. I explicitly mandated that Tanya was permanently barred from acting as a trustee, signatory, or proxy. She would never possess the legal authority to touch a single cent of the principal or the interest. The wealth she had so desperately coveted was permanently secured for the next generation, completely bypassing her greedy, blistered hands. My father and mother listened to the rapid clinical dictation of the legal parameters. The deep, agonizing tension that had gripped their fragile bodies for weeks finally evaporated. They looked at the airtight legal structure protecting their legacy and let out a long, synchronized exhale of pure relief. They knew their final wealth was permanently safe from manipulation and fraud. The rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitors began to slow the tempo dropping as their physical bodies surrendered to the inevitable. Within the hour, they passed away, peacefully slipping into the dark with the absolute certainty that their monumental mistakes had been forcefully corrected. I stood over their silent forms, the finalized trust documents gripped tightly in my hand. The legal war was decisively over, but the final brutal fallout was just beginning. Tanya was currently scrubbing floors in the dark, entirely unaware that her inheritance had been surgically removed. The imminent revelation of her total disinheritance was set to trigger a massive, volatile confrontation at the impending funeral. A cold, relentless rain battered the dark umbrellas clustered tightly around the open graves. The heavy gray sky perfectly mirrored the grim finality of the double funeral. Tanya stood directly across from me, her face buried deep in a black lace handkerchief, executing a flawless performance of a devastated, grieving daughter. She wept loudly, her shoulders shaking with theatrical intensity, leaning heavily on the arm of a distant cousin to ensure every attendee witnessed her profound, manufactured sorrow. She was entirely oblivious to the monumental shift in power that had occurred in that sterile hospital room just days prior. As the polished mahogany caskets were slowly lowered into the muddy earth, the murmurs of condolences began to fade. The gathered crowd respectfully stepped back, anticipating the traditional family dismissal. I did not move toward the waiting limousines. I nodded slightly to Alyssa. She stepped forward to the very edge of the artificial turf lining the gravesite, holding a pristine, leather-bound legal folio. The rain drummed a steady, heavy beat against the synthetic fabric of her black umbrella. Alyssa cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the storm with sharp, clinical precision. She announced that as the primary executor of the estate, I had explicitly authorized the immediate public reading of Wendell and Shirley's final binding trust. Tanya lowered her handkerchief, her eyes darting between me and Alyssa in sudden, sharp confusion. Alyssa did not pause to allow the murmurs to settle. She read the legal provisions aloud, her tone completely devoid of emotion. She detailed the immediate unilateral transfer of the fully recovered family home and all liquidated assets directly into my name. She then read the brutal, mathematically perfect restrictions of the newly established educational trust. She explicitly stated that the remaining funds were permanently locked, exclusively reserved for university tuition for Tanya's children, and strictly inaccessible for any personal use. Alyssa looked directly at Tanya and delivered the final, crushing clause. She announced that Tanya was legally barred from acting as a proxy or trustee, permanently excising her from the family wealth. The black lace handkerchief dropped from Tanya's hands, landing silently in the thick mud. The theatrical tears vanished instantly, entirely replaced by a contorted, hideous mask of absolute rage. Her pristine facade shattered into a million jagged pieces right there beside the open graves. She stared at me, the full, devastating reality of her complete disinheritance crashing down upon her. The polite, somber silence of the cemetery was violently shattered. Tanya lunged forward, her black designer heels sinking deeply into the wet, unstable earth. She disregarded the heavy rain matting her hair and ruining her expensive mourning attire. She charged to the very edge of the fresh, dark dirt piled beside our parents' graves, screaming my name with a raw, guttural ferocity. She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my chest, her voice echoing shrilly over the rows of granite headstones. She frantically accused me of orchestrating a malicious, calculated corporate coup against our own blood. In her desperate, twisted narrative, I was the ultimate villain who had ruthlessly isolated two sick, vulnerable old people and aggressively brainwashed them on their literal deathbeds. She yelled that I had exploited their final moments of weakness to steal her rightful inheritance out of pure vindictive jealousy over her previous high society lifestyle. She demanded that this gathered crowd recognize my supposed treachery, frantically spinning a narrative where she was the innocent victim of a colossal orchestrated theft. She screamed that she was the favored child, the one who truly deserved the financial security of the estate, entirely ignoring the 6 brutal years she spent bleeding them dry. I stood perfectly still, my expression a mask of cold, unyielding stone. I did not raise my voice to match her manic pitch or attempt to defend my actions to the shocked, whispering onlookers. Her public meltdown was simply the final, predictable symptom of her profound, incurable entitlement. Realizing that her shrieking accusations were not breaking my composure, Tanya's rage mutated into a vicious, desperate threat. She slammed her hands against her sides and formally vowed to drag me into an endless, brutal legal war. She swore she would retain the most aggressive, high-powered estate litigators in the state to shatter the trust. She promised to tie up the assets in probate court for a decade if necessary, fully intending to forcibly extract the cash she firmly believed she was owed. She demanded the money to rebuild the affluent lifestyle Bradley had destroyed, explicitly refusing to accept the harsh, impoverished reality currently staring her in the face. She stood over the open graves of the parents she had financially abused and promised to desecrate their final wishes to satisfy her own boundless, unrepentant greed. Before Tanya could launch into another hysterical tirade, Alyssa stepped smoothly between us. She moved with the silent, lethal grace of an executioner closing the final trap. She did not raise an umbrella to shield herself from the driving rain. She reached into the interior pocket of her tailored wool coat and extracted a thick, heavily sealed manila envelope. She held it up, allowing the rain to slick the waterproof exterior, and locked her cold, professional gaze directly onto Tanya's flushed face. Alyssa did not address the whispering crowd. She spoke in a low, sharp register intended solely for my sister's ears. Alyssa calmly informed Tanya that the envelope contained a comprehensive, meticulously documented dossier of her complete financial history. She detailed the exact contents, years of heavily redacted tax returns, hidden offshore routing numbers, and definitive forensic proof of Tanya's willful complicity in Bradley's massive tax evasion schemes. Alyssa explicitly outlined how Tanya had actively signed fraudulent joint tax filings, knowingly sheltering cartel-linked funds while living in her luxury estate. The documents proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Tanya was not a blind, innocent spouse, but a fully aware, highly culpable accessory to federal tax fraud. Alyssa delivered the ultimate non-negotiable ultimatum. She stated with absolute clarity that the exact moment Tanya filed a single piece of litigation against the estate or attempted to challenge the ironclad trust, the entire dossier would be automatically and immediately submitted to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. A probate lawsuit would instantaneously trigger a massive federal audit, virtually guaranteeing Tanya a concrete cell right next to her imprisoned husband. The blood drained completely from Tanya's face, leaving her a pale, shivering ghost in the relentless downpour. Her mouth snapped shut with an audible click. The frantic screaming rage instantly dissolved into pure paralyzing terror. She stared at the manila envelope, fully realizing that she was completely cornered. She possessed absolutely no leverage, no wealth, and no viable escape route. Alyssa slowly lowered the envelope and stepped back to my side. The heavy, somber silence of the cemetery was instantly restored, broken only by the steady drumming of the rain against the caskets. Tanya lowered her gaze to the mud, utterly defeated. Stripped of all her arrogant illusions and her stolen wealth, she was finally forced to accept her harsh reality. She would have to scrub floors and labor relentlessly just to survive. 6 months dragged by with the slow, punishing rhythm of actual unglamorous labor. The bitter winter yielded to a sweltering, unforgiving summer, and with the oppressive heat came the birth of Tanya's son. There was no private luxury maternity suite, no catered meals, and absolutely no syndicate-funded trust waiting to instantly secure his future. Tanya brought the boy home to a cramped, drafty studio apartment located on the industrial outskirts of the city. The crushing reality of her new isolated existence materialized immediately in the checkout aisles of discount grocery stores. The staggering, unrelenting cost of basic infant formula and heavy boxes of diapers drained her meager, hard-earned savings with terrifying speed. Stripped entirely of her hidden offshore accounts and permanently legally barred from the family wealth she possessed, absolutely no safety net. Pure, undeniable desperation forced her directly back through the double-glass doors of the commercial cleaning company she had once viewed as a temporary, humiliating indignity. She swallowed her pride and requested the grueling overnight double shifts. She strapped on the heavy, unyielding rubber boots and dragged the massive industrial utility cart through miles of echoing, dimly lit corporate hallways. The physical work was brutal and entirely unforgiving. She scrubbed porcelain toilets with harsh, concentrated alkaline chemicals until her lungs burned and her eyes watered from the toxic fumes. She pushed heavy, roaring vacuum cleaners across endless acres of plush executive carpeting, her spine screaming in sharp agony with every repetitive, forceful motion. The soft, meticulously manicured hands that had once proudly displayed Bradley's illicit blood diamond jewelry were fundamentally destroyed. The angry, weeping blisters she suffered during her first week of manual labor eventually ruptured, healed, and hardened into thick, permanent calluses. She learned the exact, unforgiving price of a single dollar by measuring it against the agonizing ache deep in her joints. Every toilet she scrubbed and every trash bin she emptied was a direct, inescapable consequence of her profound greed. She no longer possessed the energy to plot legal revenge or harbor arrogant delusions of breaking the ironclad trust. Her entire universe forcefully narrowed down to the immediate survival of her infant child and the harsh, rhythmic squeak of her rubber-soled shoes against the polished linoleum floors. The oppressive compounding weight of sheer physical exhaustion finally caught up with her during a particularly grueling late-night shift in the downtown financial district. The cleaning dispatcher had assigned her to the top floor of the main executive tower. It was my private suite. The massive building was completely deserted, wrapped tightly in the heavy, absolute silence of 3 a.m. Tanya pushed her squeaking utility cart into my expansive office, her muscles trembling uncontrollably from 14 consecutive hours of manual labor. She wiped down the long mahogany conference table with a rag smelling faintly of ammonia and moved slowly toward the massive desk where I conducted the daily operations of my legal empire. Her vision blurred slightly at the edges. Her breathing was shallow, ragged, and heavy in the quiet room. She picked up a soft microfiber cloth to dust the polished wooden credenza positioned directly behind my high-backed leather chair. Her calloused, numb fingers fumbled clumsily as she reached across the polished surface. A heavy, silver-plated frame slipped entirely from her exhausted grasp. It struck the sharp edge of the mahogany desk and plummeted directly toward the floor. The glass shattered violently across the expensive Persian rug, the sharp cracking sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent, cavernous room. Tanya gasped sharply, dropping instantly to her hands and knees in a frantic, terrifying panic. She reached out blindly to gather the jagged shards, completely heedless of the sharp edges slicing deep into her hardened, rough skin. She flipped the heavy silver frame over with shaking hands to aggressively inspect the damage. The photograph beneath the spiderweb of broken glass instantly stopped the breath in her lungs. It was a picture of me standing tall and proud at exactly 65 years old, draped heavily in my law school graduation robes. I was holding my framed degree, my face lined with deep exhaustion but radiating absolute, undeniable triumph. Tanya stared down at the frozen image of the brother she had so gleefully mocked. She vividly remembered the luxurious family dinner 6 years ago where she had arrogantly stolen the exact funds meant to pay for that degree. She looked at the visual proof of my grueling, unassisted victory, and the full crushing weight of her monstrous betrayal finally shattered the very last remaining wall of her ego. The heavy frosted glass door of the executive office swung open with a soft click. I walked calmly into the room wearing a long charcoal overcoat, having returned late to retrieve a highly specific legal briefing I needed for an early morning deposition. I stopped just inside the threshold, quietly taking in the scene. Tanya was kneeling on the rug, completely surrounded by glittering shards of broken glass, clutching my graduation photograph tightly to her chest. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl vindictive insults or aggressively demand to know why she was destroying my personal property. I calmly unbuttoned my overcoat and draped it smoothly over the back of a leather guest chair. I walked directly to her utility cart, retrieved the industrial broom and the plastic dustpan, and stepped onto the Persian rug. I reached down gently but firmly, took the silver frame from her trembling hands, and set it carefully on the desk. Then I began to sweep up the broken glass myself. The quiet, dignified rhythm of the broom bristles against the rug completely and utterly broke her. Tanya collapsed forward, pressing her forehead directly against the floor. For the very first time in her entire life, she did not deflect blame point fingers or manufacture a convenient excuse. She uttered a raw, suffocating apology, her broken voice tearing through the silent office. She explicitly acknowledged the profound depth of her cruelty, taking absolute, unvarnished ownership of the theft, the mockery, and the deceit. She begged for my forgiveness without attaching a single manipulative demand for money, shelter, or legal salvation. I finished sweeping the glass and deposited the jagged shards securely into her waste bin. I looked down at the weeping woman who had finally been humbled by the brutal, unyielding reality of the world. I accepted her apology, letting the profound silence wash away the lingering toxic ghosts of our past. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a single sheet of printed paper. It was a strict, highly regulated employment contract for an entry-level clerical position within my firm. I informed her coldly that the apology had successfully broken the ice, but our future dynamic would be governed strictly by absolute, uncompromising boundaries. She would earn her survival and provide for her child through honest sweat, and she would do it entirely under my precise terms. I stepped around Tanya's kneeling form, the crunch of a few overlooked glass fragments grinding softly beneath the leather soles of my shoes. I moved deliberately toward my heavy mahogany desk, the very sanctuary where I had systematically built the prosperous life she once deeply despised. Opening the top right drawer, I retrieved a single crisp sheet of high-grade printer paper. It was a standard, unmodified human resources document, the exact type of form issued to every entry-level employee who walked through the heavy glass doors of my firm. I returned to where Tanya remained on the Persian rug, her chest still heaving from the raw, suffocating emotion of her confession. I held the document out, forcing her to look up and read the bold black text printed across the top. It was an official offer of employment for a junior clerical position in the basement records department of my law firm. I explained with total clinical detachment that this was not a rescue mission funded by lingering familial obligation. This was a brutal ground-level entry point into the actual unforgiving workforce. I pointed to the compensation clause highlighted near the middle of the page. The salary was set strictly and immutably at the state minimum wage. There were no hidden annual bonuses, no generous signing advances to secure a comfortable apartment, and absolutely no corporate housing stipends to lift her out of her current dismal living situation. She would earn exactly what the open market dictated for an unskilled worker with zero applicable administrative experience. I told her that she would have to meticulously budget every single paycheck to cover her rent, her utilities, and the staggering, unrelenting cost of her infant's formula. If she could not stretch those meager funds to survive the month, I would not step in to magically cover the deficit. She was standing at the absolute bottom of the corporate ladder, facing a mountain of grueling, monotonous labor, sorting thousands of dense legal briefs and dusty archived case files. I made it entirely clear that the days of limitless platinum credit cards, designer wardrobes, and unearned luxury were permanently and irrevocably over. The only currency that mattered in this building was relentless, uncomplaining effort. She stared at the stark numbers on the paper, the mathematical reality of her new life calculating brutally in her exhausted mind. She realized I was offering her the hardest path imaginable, completely stripped of any safety net or emotional padding. I did not allow her time to process the shock of the minimum wage clause before detailing the rigid, uncompromising stipulations embedded in the lower half of the contract. I explained that sweeping floors and filing paperwork would not sustain her or her growing child indefinitely. The contract strictly mandated her immediate enrollment in an accredited night school program to obtain a professional administrative certificate. She would work her grueling 8-hour shifts in my records department during the day and spend her exhausted evenings sitting in a stark, fluorescently lit community college classroom. I demanded absolute flawless compliance with this educational directive. The employment agreement contained a draconian zero-tolerance policy regarding attendance and performance. A single unexcused absence from either her shift at the firm or her required evening classes would result in her immediate uncontested termination. I would not entertain fabricated excuses about heavy traffic, physical fatigue, or the inherent overwhelming difficulties of single motherhood. The margin for error was mathematically zero. Furthermore, I explicitly severed any lingering expectation of nepotism or preferential treatment within the walls of my corporate empire. I informed Tanya that she possessed absolutely no family privileges. She would not bypass the standard chain of command under any circumstances. She would report directly to a stern, uncompromising office manager who had zero knowledge of our biological connection. She would eat her packed lunches in the crowded employee break room and use the freight elevator alongside the rest of the support staff. I stepped closer, ensuring my final condition resonated with absolute chilling clarity. During business hours within the perimeter of my firm, she was legally barred from addressing me by my first name or claiming any familial bond to her coworkers. She would refer to me exclusively and respectfully as Mr. Hayes. She was to become a silent, invisible cog in the massive machinery of my business, earning her place through sheer undeniable merit. If she crossed my path in the hallway, she would nod politely and keep walking without uttering a word. I was stripping away the last remaining fragments of her unearned status, demanding that she rebuild her entire identity entirely from scratch. The rules were intentionally suffocating, designed specifically to test the absolute limits of her newfound humility. I watched her tired eyes scan the harsh paragraphs, absorbing the immense, punishing weight of the climb that awaited her. Tanya remained kneeling on the floor, her trembling, calloused hands gripping the sharp edges of the printed contract. The deep, heavy silence of the executive suite pressed down on her as she stared at the harsh, uncompromising conditions laid out before her. Years ago, the very idea of accepting a minimum wage clerical job under such draconian terms would have triggered an explosive, vicious tantrum. The old Tanya would have laughed directly in my face, tossed the paper aside in disgust, and demanded a six-figure executive title simply for existing as my sister. But the old Tanya was completely and permanently dead. The brutal, unrelenting reality of scrubbing corporate toilets to buy baby formula had systematically pulverized her immense toxic arrogance into fine dust. She looked at the permanent calluses hardening on her palms, the undeniable physical proof of her staggering, violent fall from grace. She understood with absolute crystalline clarity that this grueling, unforgiving contract was her one and only legitimate lifeline. It was a miserable, exhausting path, but it was honest. It offered a legitimate escape from the suffocating cycle of deep poverty, provided she was willing to bleed for it. She slowly pushed herself up from the floor, her sore, aching muscles protesting the difficult movement. She stood before my massive mahogany desk, her wet hair clinging tightly to her cheeks, the oversized, stained janitor's uniform hanging loosely from her exhausted frame. She did not attempt to negotiate. She did not ask for a slightly higher hourly rate or plead for leniency regarding the strict educational mandates. She bit her lower lip, nodding once in total solemn submission to the reality of her situation. I retrieved a heavy silver fountain pen from my desk organizer and extended it toward her across the wide desk. She reached out her fingers, wrapping tightly around the cool metal. She leaned over the polished wood and pressed the nib against the dotted line at the absolute bottom of the page. She signed her name with slow, deliberate strokes, legally binding herself to the arduous, painful journey of her own redemption. The ink dried instantly, solidifying the final permanent state of our fractured family dynamic. I pulled the signed contract across the desk and filed it away, officially marking the definitive end of the war. She turned and walked out of the office, pushing her heavy cleaning cart toward the service elevator. She was entirely stripped of her wealth and her pride, but as she disappeared down the dark hallway, she possessed something far more valuable. She finally possessed a genuine, hard-earned future. The rhythmic, mechanical clatter of a cheap plastic keyboard echoed down the narrow, windowless corridor of the basement records department. 6 exact months had passed since the ink dried on the minimum wage employment contract. Tanya sat rigidly in a cramped gray fabric cubicle, her eyes locked onto the glowing monitor. She wore a neat, highly discounted navy blazer she had purchased from a local thrift store, the fabric stiff and unyielding against her shoulders. The designer silks and imported cashmere that once defined her entire existence were permanently gone, replaced entirely by the practical, muted uniform of the working class. She reached across her small desk, her fingers grasping a towering stack of dense, heavily redacted corporate litigation files. The thick permanent calluses on her palms scraped audibly against the manila folders, a lingering physical reminder of the brutal overnight cleaning shifts she had endured to survive the winter. She did not pause to stretch her aching back or complain about the suffocating monotony of the labor. She systematically cross-referenced case numbers, inputting data with a fierce, relentless precision. The irony of her task was absolute. She was organizing bankruptcy filings and foreclosure notices for strangers, actively processing the very financial ruin she had narrowly escaped. Every single keystroke represented a fraction of a cent. Every completed file translated directly into the exact cost of infant formula, heavily rationed diapers, and the rigid monthly utility bills for her drafty studio apartment. She calculated her survival down to the absolute decimal. There was no margin for luxury, no room for error, and no hidden safety net waiting to catch her if she faltered. She checked the digital clock on her monitor. She had exactly 2 hours remaining in her shift before she had to catch the crosstown bus, retrieve her son from the subsidized daycare center, and immediately log into her mandatory administrative night classes. The suffocating arrogance of her youth had been entirely pulverized, leaving behind a hardened, unbreakable resolve. She was earning her life. She was paying her own way through the grueling, unglamorous dirt, accepting the harsh reality of her self-inflicted destruction without a single word of protest. 50 floors above the subterranean records department, the climate-controlled executive suite hummed with the quiet, expensive sound of absolute security. I sat behind my polished mahogany desk, my eyes scanning the complex, real-time financial matrices flashing across my dual monitors. I pulled up the heavily encrypted ledger detailing the core family trust. The original $100,000 I had managed to salvage and protect during the initial chaos of Bradley's catastrophic financial implosion had not sat dormant. Through a series of highly aggressive, shrewd, and exceptionally patient market maneuvers, I had successfully quadrupled the principal investment. The wealth that my parents had so recklessly endangered was now fortified behind an impenetrable wall of diversified high-yield corporate bonds and untouchable offshore securities. I cross-referenced the newly minted property deeds. The family home, once leveraged to the brink of foreclosure by syndicate enforcers, was permanently secured, fully paid off, and legally shielded from any future liens. My parents' legacy was entirely protected, perfectly insulated from the parasitic greed that had ultimately driven them to their early graves. I closed the financial tab and briefly opened the federal penal registry. Bradley's inmate identification number glowed in stark white text against the dark screen. He was currently serving the first 6 months of his 15-year mandatory sentence in a maximum security concrete cell, entirely stripped of his tailored suits and his manipulative charm. The cartel associates who had once lurked in the shadows threatening to dismantle my empire had been systematically eradicated. The exhaustive financial dossiers I had surrendered to the federal prosecutors had triggered a massive, highly coordinated tactical sweep, resulting in multiple high-level racketeering indictments. The underground syndicate was permanently dismantled, their violent leverage over my family completely severed. I deleted the penal registry tab from my browser history. Bradley and the violent underworld he represented were completely erased from my existence. The ledgers were balanced, the liabilities were neutralized, and the financial foundation of my firm was stronger and more resilient than it had ever been. I pushed my high-backed leather chair away from the desk and walked slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling glass window. I stood with my hands clasped loosely behind my back, looking down at the sprawling, rain-slicked city streets far below. The dense traffic moved in a chaotic, endless rhythm, but inside my office the atmosphere was a sanctuary of absolute, undisturbed peace. The chaotic, emotionally draining war that had consumed my family for 6 years was decisively over. There had been no tearful, cinematic reconciliation. There was no grand, emotional forgiveness granted in the aftermath of the devastation. I had not magically absolved Tanya of her profound cruelty, nor had I simply forgotten the years I spent grinding through law school while she squandered my stolen tuition. I had instead instituted a system of pure, unyielding consequences. The boundaries I had established were absolute and non-negotiable. Every ounce of disrespect, every stolen dollar, and every arrogant insult had been paid back in full through literal sweat, humiliation, and forced labor. The dynamic of our bloodline had undergone a permanent fatal adjustment. Tanya was no longer the entitled princess demanding an unearned throne. She was a simple, functioning employee, surviving entirely on her own merit, confined to the basement where her toxic entitlement could no longer infect the family structure. The silence in the executive suite was not the heavy, suffocating quiet of unresolved tension. It was the clear, resonant silence of a machine operating exactly as designed. The infection had been isolated, the rot had been cut out, and the structural integrity of my life had been flawlessly restored. I turned away from the glass, walked back to my desk, and opened the next stack of legal briefings. The silent adjustment was complete, echoing only with the steady, uncompromising rhythm of honest survival. Heavy rain lashed against a sea of black umbrellas, shielding the sparse gathering of mourners from the bitter cold. The cemetery was a bleak expanse of gray stone and saturated earth, perfectly matching the grim finality of the double burial. I stood near the edge of the deep twin graves, my tailored overcoat deflecting the downpour, watching the polished mahogany caskets slowly descend into the mud. Directly across from me, Tanya executed a flawless, highly calculated performance of a devastated daughter. She wept loudly, her face buried deep in a black lace handkerchief, leaning heavily against a distant cousin to ensure every attendee registered her profound manufactured sorrow. She was entirely oblivious to the monumental shift in power that had occurred in the sterile palliative care unit just days prior. As the cemetery workers stepped back to allow the family their final moments, the murmurs of polite condolences began to fade. The gathered crowd shifted, anticipating the traditional dismissal toward the waiting limousines. I did not move. I gave a slight, deliberate nod to Alyssa. She stepped forward to the very edge of the artificial green turf lining the gravesite, holding a pristine leather-bound legal folio. The rain drummed a steady, relentless beat against the synthetic fabric of her black umbrella. Alyssa cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the storm with sharp, clinical precision. She announced to the remaining attendees that as the primary executor of the estate, I had explicitly authorized the immediate public reading of Wendell and Shirley's final binding trust. Tanya lowered her handkerchief slowly, her eyes darting between me and Alyssa in sudden, sharp confusion. Alyssa did not pause to allow the murmurs to settle. She read the legal provisions aloud, her tone completely devoid of emotion or hesitation. She detailed the immediate, unilateral transfer of the fully recovered family home and all liquidated assets directly into my name. She then read the brutal, mathematically perfect restrictions of the newly established educational trust. She explicitly stated that the remaining funds were permanently locked, exclusively reserved for university tuition for Tanya's unborn child, and strictly inaccessible for any form of daily living expenses or personal debt relief. Alyssa looked directly at Tanya and delivered the final crushing clause. She announced that Tanya was legally barred from acting as a proxy signatory or trustee, permanently excising her from the family wealth. The black lace handkerchief dropped from Tanya's hands, landing silently in the thick mud. The theatrical tears vanished instantly, entirely replaced by a contorted, hideous mask of absolute rage. Her pristine facade shattered into a million jagged pieces right there beside the open graves. She stared at me, the full, devastating reality of her complete disinheritance crashing down upon her. The polite, somber silence of the cemetery was violently shattered. Tanya lunged forward, her black designer heels sinking deeply into the wet, unstable earth. She disregarded the heavy rain matting her hair and ruining her expensive mourning attire. She charged to the very edge of the fresh, dark dirt piled beside our parents' graves, screaming my name with a raw, guttural ferocity. She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my chest, her voice echoing shrilly over the rows of granite headstones. She frantically accused me of orchestrating a malicious, calculated corporate coup against our own blood. In her desperate, twisted narrative, I was the ultimate villain who had ruthlessly isolated two sick, vulnerable old people and aggressively brainwashed them on their literal deathbeds. She yelled that I had exploited their final moments of weakness to steal her rightful inheritance out of pure vindictive jealousy over her previous high society lifestyle. She demanded that the gathered crowd recognize my supposed treachery, frantically spinning a narrative where she was the innocent victim of a colossal orchestrated theft. She screamed that she was the favored child, the one who truly deserved the financial security of the estate, entirely ignoring the 6 brutal years she spent bleeding them dry. I stood perfectly still, my expression a mask of cold, unyielding stone. I did not raise my voice to match her manic pitch or attempt to defend my actions to the shocked, whispering onlookers. Her public meltdown was simply the final, predictable symptom of her profound, incurable entitlement. Realizing that her shrieking accusations were not breaking my composure, Tanya's rage mutated into a vicious, desperate threat. She slammed her hands against her sides and formally vowed to drag me into an endless, brutal legal war. She swore she would retain the most aggressive, high-powered estate litigators in the state to shatter the ironclad trust. She promised to tie up the assets in probate court for a decade if necessary, fully intending to forcibly extract the cash she firmly believed she was owed. She demanded the money to rebuild the affluent lifestyle Bradley had destroyed, explicitly refusing to accept the harsh, impoverished reality currently staring her in the face. She stood over the open graves of the parents she had financially abused and promised to desecrate their final wishes to satisfy her own boundless, unrepentant greed. Before Tanya could launch into another hysterical tirade, Alyssa stepped smoothly between us. She moved with the silent, lethal grace of an executioner closing the final trap. She did not raise an umbrella to shield herself from the driving rain. She reached into the interior pocket of her tailored wool coat and extracted a thick, heavily sealed manila envelope. She held it up, allowing the rain to slick the waterproof exterior, and locked her cold, professional gaze directly onto Tanya's flushed face. Alyssa did not address the whispering crowd. She spoke in a low, sharp register intended solely for my sister's ears. Alyssa calmly informed Tanya that the envelope contained a comprehensive, meticulously documented dossier of her complete financial history. She detailed the exact contents: years of heavily redacted tax returns, hidden offshore routing numbers, and definitive forensic proof of Tanya's willful complicity in Bradley's massive tax evasion schemes. Alyssa explicitly outlined how Tanya had actively signed fraudulent joint tax filings, knowingly sheltering cartel-linked funds while living in her luxury estate. The documents proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Tanya was not a blind, innocent spouse, but a fully aware, highly culpable accessory to federal tax fraud. Alyssa delivered the ultimate non-negotiable ultimatum. She stated with absolute clarity that the exact moment Tanya filed a single piece of litigation against the estate or attempted to challenge the ironclad trust, the entire dossier would be automatically and immediately submitted to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. A probate lawsuit would instantaneously trigger a massive federal audit, virtually guaranteeing Tanya a concrete cell right next to her imprisoned husband. The blood drained completely from Tanya's face, leaving her a pale, shivering ghost in the relentless downpour. Her mouth snapped shut with an audible click. The frantic, screaming rage instantly dissolved into pure, paralyzing terror. She stared at the manila envelope, fully realizing that she was completely cornered. She possessed absolutely no leverage, no wealth, and no viable escape route. Alyssa slowly lowered the envelope and stepped back to my side. The heavy, somber silence of the cemetery was instantly restored, broken only by the steady drumming of the rain against the caskets. Tanya lowered her gaze to the mud, utterly defeated. Stripped of all her arrogant illusions and her stolen wealth, she was finally forced to accept her harsh reality. She would have to scrub floors and labor relentlessly just to survive. True wealth is not measured by the numbers in a bank account, but by the unyielding integrity of one's character and the boundaries established against toxic manipulation. When we allow greed to dictate familial obligations, we sacrifice our own peace for temporary appeasement. True empowerment arises when we finally sever the financial strings that enable abuse, recognizing that enabling destructive behavior ultimately ruins both the giver and the receiver. Real redemption is never found in inherited luxury, but is forged through genuine accountability, relentless hard work, and the painful yet vital realization that respect must be meticulously earned, never demanded.